Hey guys, tonight we're embarking on a journey to a vast, vibrant, and often rather tumultuous continent a few centuries back in time. Picture yourself, if you will, not in your familiar, comfortable bed, but perhaps standing on the docks of a bustling colonial port like Cartagena or Salvador de Bahia, or maybe trekking through the high, thin air of the Andes near a silver mine like Potosi. We're venturing into colonial South America, a world of immense wealth for a privileged few and stark, grinding poverty for many. And tonight, we're going to be exploring a particularly grim yet fascinating aspect of daily life in this era. The often peculiar and invariably quite harsh penalties that awaited those desperate or perhaps just daring enough to steal food. Now imagine trying to survive as, say, a hungry newly arrived and entirely penniless peasant, or perhaps an escaped enslaved person in colonial Lima, or the aforementioned Potosi. The tantalizing whiff of roasting guinea pig, or perhaps some exotic spiced fruit from a wealthy viceroy's kitchen, might mingle with the far less appealing aroma of, well, widespread desperation and questionable street sanitation. Your chances of casually borrowing a forgotten loaf of bread from a bakery stall without facing some rather inventive and decidedly unpleasant forms of colonial justice would be, let's just say, exceedingly perilously slim. They took their cassava, their maize, and their control over resources very, very seriously indeed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I'd love to know where you're drifting off from tonight. Drop your location and current time in the comments below. It's always a quiet pleasure to see how far these sleepy tales travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself a Jeria transported across the vast Atlantic to the sprawling, diverse, and often deeply unequal lands of colonial South America, sometime between the 16th and early 19th centuries. This is a continent under the dominion of the great Iberian powers, Spain and Portugal. Their flags planted firmly from the humid rainforests of the Amazon basin and the sun-drenched Caribbean coasts across the towering snow-capped Andes mountains down to the fertile river valleys and the vast windswept pampas of the south. It's a world of newly established colonial cities with their grand cathedrals and imposing administrative buildings, of sprawling agricultural estates, haciendas and fazendas, worked by indigenous laborers and enslaved Africans, and of enormously wealthy silver and gold mines that fuel the coffers of distant European monarchies. And at the very heart of this colonial enterprise, shaping every aspect of daily life from the grandest viceregal palace to the humblest peasant's hut, is the control and distribution of food. The colonial pantry, if we can call it that, is a study in dramatic, often brutal contrasts. On one hand, you have tables groaning under the weight of abundance, at least for the European elite. The viceroys, the governors, the wealthy landowners, hacendados or fazenderos, the high-ranking clergy, and the successful merchants. Their meals are a fascinating and often ostentatious blend of imported European luxuries and the newfound bounty of the Americas. Imagine the scene at a governor's banquet in Lima or Mexico City. Though our focus is South America, the pattern is similar. Fine wines and olive oil shipped laboriously from Spain, wheat bread, a status symbol compared to native grains, alongside succulent roasted meats from newly introduced livestock like cattle, pigs, and sheep. And intermingled with these old world flavors are the wonders of the new world. Maize potatoes, tomatoes, sweet potatoes, cassava beans, squash, avocados, pineapples, and the precious cacao bean, from which that rich, bitter chocolate drink beloved of the Aztec and Maya is now being adapted, sweetened, and increasingly craved by the colonizers. The colonial elite's dinner table was in many ways a delicious edible geography lesson, a testament to global trade and imperial power. "Ah, my dear guests," a viceroy might declare, gesturing with a lace-cuffed hand. "Tonight we shall enjoy some lovely Spanish sherry, followed by a hearty Peruvian chupe made with Andean potatoes, perhaps a main course of Argentine beef. A bit later in the colonial period for that. But you get the idea, a delightful side of Brazilian cassava, farofa, and for dessert, a rich chocolate confection from the cacao beans of Venezuela, all accompanied, of course, by a healthy serving of our divinely ordained right to exploit the local workforce and extract every last ounce of wealth from this bountiful new continent. The unstated yet ever-present ingredient on many of those lavish tables was the hunger and hardship of those who produced the feast. For on the other side of this colonial culinary coin lies the stark, grim reality faced by the vast majority of the population. The indigenous peoples often forced into systems of tribute and harsh labor like the Andean Mita or the encomienda. The millions of enslaved Africans toiling on sugar plantations in Brazil or in the gold mines of New Granada, and even many poor European settlers, indentured servants, or marginalized mestizos and mulattoes. For these groups, malnutrition, chronic food insecurity, and periods of outright famine were all too common. Their diets were often monotonous, consisting primarily of whatever basic staples they could cultivate on meager plots of land, or whatever insufficient rations were doled out by their masters or overseers. Food in this colonial context, Egeria becomes far more than just sustenance. It is a potent instrument of power and social control. A mainstream historical fact is that the entire colonial system in South America was built upon the European control of land and the coercive exploitation of indigenous and African labor to produce both subsistence crops and, more importantly for the imperial powers, lucrative export commodities like sugar, cacao, coffee, cotton, and of course, precious metals. Those who controlled the land controlled the food supply, and those who controlled the food supply held immense power over those who did not. Access to adequate food was a clear and constant marker of one's place in the rigid social hierarchy. Rations for enslaved workers were often deliberately kept at a bare subsistence level. Indigenous communities were frequently forced to pay tribute in the form of agricultural produce, sometimes leaving their own families with little to eat. Withholding food or the threat of it could be a powerful tool for enforcing obedience and quelling dissent. Given these vast disparities, this chasm between overflowing colonial pantries and the aching hunger of so many, it is hardly surprising that food theft was a common, if exceptionally risky occurrence. Stealing food, whether a few ears of maize from a plantation field, a loaf of bread from a market stall, a chicken from a landowner's coop, or a sack of potatoes from a guarded storehouse, was often an act of sheer desperation, a gamble taken to ward off starvation for oneself or one's family. But in the eyes of colonial law and the property-owning elite who largely shaped and enforced that law, such acts were not seen as tragic consequences of an unjust system. They were serious crimes, direct challenges to property rights, to social order, and to the authority of the colonial state and its masters. The extent to which food theft in colonial South America should be interpreted primarily as individual acts driven by sheer survival needs, versus being in some instances a more conscious or unconscious form of covert social protest, everyday resistance, or a desperate reclaiming of resources against the perceived injustices of oppressive colonial labor systems and exploitative economic structures, is a complex and fascinating question actively explored by social historians who study the daily lives, coping mechanisms, and agency of subaltern populations on it in this period. And the consequences for being caught, Egeria, could be dire indeed. The penalties were designed not just to punish the individual offender, but to serve as a terrifying public example, a stark warning to others who might be tempted by hunger or defiance. As we begin to delve into the specifics of these punishments, you will see that they were often imaginative in their cruelty, public in their execution, and deeply reflective of a colonial mindset that valued property, especially the property of the elite, far above the well-being or even the lives of those at the bottom of its rigidly stratified society. In some parts of colonial South America, Egeria stealing a single potato wasn't just a minor, regrettable snack-related infraction that might earn you a stern telling off. That potato, you see, represented someone's hard-won agricultural labor, often forced someone else's carefully calculated profit margin, and just possibly a vital ingredient in the colonial governor's highly anticipated evening stew. You mess with the governor's potato, or indeed any food item deemed to belong to the powerful, and you were likely in for a truly memorable and peculiarly unpleasant encounter with the full, unblinking force of colonial justice. The stage is set, the pantries are both full and empty, and the peculiar penalties await our sleepy, cautious exploration. You find yourself now Egeria, firmly planted in the midst of colonial South America, a vast continent of dramatic contrasts where immense wealth extracted from mines and plantations existed alongside profound, often desperate poverty. We've glimpsed the stark reality of the colonial pantry. overflowing for the European elite tragically bare for so many of the indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, and marginalized Tosh colonists who formed the backbone of this imperial enterprise. This chasm between abundance and hunger inevitably led to acts of desperation and food theft, as we've noted, was a common if perilous response. But what were the actual rules of the game? What legal frameworks, what codes of conduct and consequence governed life in these sprawling Spanish and Portuguese territories and defined the peculiar penalties that awaited those who dared to steal a mouthful to understand the punishment you first need to appreciate the law? The legal systems imposed by Spain and Portugal upon their vast American colonies were, as you can imagine, complex, multi-layered, and deeply rooted in their own European traditions, yet also adapted, or at least intended to be adapted, to the unique circumstances of the New World. Trying to understand the full scope of colonial South American law is like attempting to assemble a truly gigantic, multi-part, three-dimensional puzzle where about half the pieces are written in exceedingly archaic, almost impenetrable legalese. A significant quarter of the pieces appear to be missing entirely, or perhaps just eaten by very well-read colonial silverfish. And the rest are probably still being argued over by bewigged legal scholars in some dusty, forgotten archive. It's a considerable challenge. Let's start with the Spanish colonies, which encompassed a huge swath of South America from the viceroyalties of Peru and New Granada down to the Rio de la Plata. The foundational legal tradition here was Castilian law, the law of the dominant kingdom within Spain. Ancient codes like the Siete Partidas, a remarkably comprehensive body of law compiled in the 13th century under Alfonso Bacas of Castile, but which remained profoundly influential for centuries, formed a key part of the legal bedrock. Alongside these older codes, a vast accumulation of royal pragmaticas, edicts, ordinances, and decrees issued by the Spanish monarchs over time also applied. More specifically for the Americas, the Spanish crown developed what became known as the Leyes de Indias, the laws of the Indies. A mainstream historical fact is that this was an immense and constantly evolving body of legislation, specifically promulgated for the governance of Spain's overseas colonies. Compiled and recompiled over several centuries, with a major codification in 1680, the Leyes de Indias attempted to regulate almost every conceivable aspect of colonial life. The structure of colonial administration, the powers of viceroys and governors, the intricate rules for trade and mining, the complex and often contradictory policies concerning the treatment and evangelization of indigenous populations, which in theory aim to protect them but often in practice, facilitated their exploitation, and of course matters of criminal justice, including theft and its punishment. Adding yet another layer, local colonial authorities, the viceroys, the governors, the powerful town councils known as cabildos, could also issue their own ordinances or bandos to address specific local conditions and concerns, provided they didn't directly contradict royal law. Meanwhile, in Portuguese Brazil, the primary legal framework was provided by the Ordenações Filipinas, the Philippine Ordinances. These were the principal law codes of Portugal compiled under King Philip II of Spain, who was also Philip I of Portugal during the Iberian Union, and promulgated in 1603, though based on earlier Portuguese legal traditions. These ordinances were similarly comprehensive, covering civil, criminal, and procedural law, and they were formally extended to govern Brazil and other Portuguese overseas territories. What were some of the key characteristics of these Iberian colonial law systems? Egeria, particularly as they might relate to our interest in food theft. Firstly, they were profoundly hierarchical and status-based. The law, and especially the penalties it prescribed, often differed significantly based on the social standing, race, and even the gender of both the offender and the victim. A crime committed by a Spaniard or a Creole, a person of Spanish descent born in the Americas against another Spaniard might be treated very differently than the same crime committed by an indigenous person, an enslaved African, or a mestizo person of mixed European and indigenous ancestry, or mulatto person of mixed European and African ancestry. This hierarchical justice system was a fundamental aspect of colonial society designed to maintain the dominance of the European colonizers. So, if a wealthy Hidalgo nobleman accidentally acquired his less influential neighbor's prize-winning llama through some slightly dubious bartering, it was probably considered a minor civil misunderstanding, best settled over a conciliatory glass of sherry. and perhaps a small discreet exchange of silver. If, however, a starving indigenous peasant or an enslaved African was caught taking that very same llama to feed their hungry family, it was far more likely to be framed as a most heinous act of llama-based grand larceny and a direct affront to the divinely ordained social order, to the public pillory with him, and let the lash sing its song of colonial justice. Secondly, these legal systems placed an enormous emphasis on the protection of property rights, particularly the property of the crown, the church, and the colonial elite. Foodstuffs, whether growing in the fields, stored in granaries, or for sale in the market, were valuable property, and their theft was a direct infringement upon these sacrosanct rights. Thirdly, Catholic morality and canon law deeply influenced concepts of sin, crime, and punishment. Offenses against the church, such as blasphemy, heresy, or the theft of sacred items, which could include food offerings, were often punished with particular severity, sometimes involving the dreaded Inquisition. And finally, as was common in most pre-modern legal systems, the penalties prescribed for many offenses were harsh, often involving capital punishment, hanging, garroting, burning, brutal corporal punishments, flogging, mutilation like the loss of a hand, or ear forced labor in mines or obrages, textile workshops, or exile to remote and undesirable penal colonies. When it came to theft specifically, hurto simple theft, or robo-robbery involving violence or threat in Spanish legal terms, the laws typically made distinctions based on the value of the goods stolen and the circumstances of the crime. Stealing something of very little value might incur a relatively minor punishment, perhaps a fine or a few lashes. Stealing something more significant or stealing repeatedly would lead to far graver consequences. Food theft could fall into various categories. Pilfering a few pieces of fruit from an orchard might be treated as a minor offense. Stealing a sack of grain from a granary, a pig from a pen, or rustling cattle would be seen as a much more serious crime against property impacting the owner's livelihood and the community's food security. Furthermore, laws against vagrancy, trespassing, or unauthorized foraging on private or crown lands could also be used to prosecute those who were essentially taking food out of desperation. There were also likely special and often particularly severe regulations concerning enslaved people or indigenous laborers found taking provisions to which they were not deemed entitled by their masters or colonial authorities. A quirky or fringe tidbit for you, Egeria, is that some sections of those voluminous Leyes de Indias were so incredibly detailed, so minutely prescriptive, that they attempted to regulate almost every conceivable facet of colonial life, from the precise grid pattern for laying out new colonial towns and the specific width of their streets, down to the type of saddles colonial officials were permitted to use, or even the appropriate number of buttons on their official waistcoats. Whether these incredibly minute and often rather finicky regulations were always, or even often, practically enforceable across the vast, remote, and often wildly diverse territories of the Spanish Americas is, of course, another matter entirely. One can almost imagine a frustrated colonial administrator in some distant Andean outpost receiving a new sheaf of royal decrees from Seville and muttering, "By the saints, another 300 pages of regulations. I do hope there's a clause in here finally clarifying the official legal penalty for a parrot that has been taught to utter seditious squawks against His Most Catholic Majesty, and specifying whether the fine should be payable in slightly bruised cacao beans or slightly chipped silver reales." No stone, or indeed no parrot, ever left unturned by the meticulous royal bureaucracy, it seems. The extent to which these formal written laws promulgated by the distant crowns of Spain and Portugal were consistently and uniformly applied in the diverse local contexts of colonial South America, versus the significant degree to which actual legal practice was shaped by unwritten customary laws, the deeply entrenched local power dynamics of influential landowners and officials, and the considerable personal discretion or caprice of individual magistrates, especially when dealing with non-elite indigenous or enslaved populations, remains a central and vital theme in the study of colonial legal history. The law on paper was one thing. The law in action in a remote village or a brutal mining camp could be quite another. But this complex, hierarchical, and often harsh legal framework, Egeria, was the backdrop against which the drama of food theft and its peculiar penalties would unfold. You're now standing, Egeria, firmly within the often harsh legal landscape of colonial South America, a world governed by the transplanted yet adapted laws of imperial Spain and Portugal. You understand that this was a hierarchical society deeply concerned with property rights, especially those of the European elite and the crown, and not shy about imposing severe penalties to maintain its rigid social order. We've acknowledged the profound disparity between the overflowing pantries of the colonizers and the gnawing hunger often experienced by the indigenous populations, enslaved Africans, and poorer European settlers. A disparity that frequently led to the desperate act of stealing food. But before we can truly delve into the peculiar penalties that awaited these unfortunate food thieves, we need to understand a bit more about what exactly constituted food, what defined its value, and how the act of taking it without permission was legally framed as a transgression in this colonial context. What was food in the eyes of colonial law when it came to theft? It wasn't just about a stolen apple or a filched loaf of bread, though those certainly counted. The definition encompassed a wide range of essential and often valuable commodities. At the most basic level, there were the staple crops that sustained life: maize, corn, potatoes, and sweet potatoes in the Andean regions, and parts of Mesoamerica that influenced South American diets. Cassava, manioc, or yucca in the tropical lowlands in Brazil, beans, squash, quinoa, and various other indigenous grains and tubers. These were not luxury items, they were the very stuff of survival for most of the population. Stealing these, especially in significant quantities, from a field or a storage hut was a direct blow to someone's livelihood or a master's provisions. Then there was livestock, a significant form of wealth and a vital source of protein, labor, and other products. Cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats, all introduced from Europe, were valuable assets. In the Andes, indigenous llamas and alpacas, crucial for transport, wool, and meat, also held immense value. Chickens, ducks, and even guinea pigs, a traditional Andean food source quickly adopted by some colonists, would also fall under this category. Rustling livestock was a far more serious offense than pilfering a few vegetables from a garden, and the penalties would reflect that. Stealing a chicken in colonial South America wasn't just about depriving someone of a potential Sunday dinner. That chicken represented future eggs, future chicks, and the landowners, or perhaps the humble peasants, inalienable right to enjoy a bit of roast poultry whenever they darn well pleased, or to sell it for a bit of income. You mess with the colonial chickenageria, and you were effectively messing with the entire socio-economic pecking order. Prepare for some correspondingly peculiar and probably rather unpleasant penalties. Beyond basic staples and livestock, there were the cultivated products from gardens, orchards, and the vast plantations that defined so much of the colonial economy. Fruits, both native varieties and those introduced from Europe or Asia, and vegetables were of course food. But then you had the cash crops, sugarcane, whose theft from a plantation field or a processing mill would be a direct hit to a major colonial industry. Cacao beans, the source of precious chocolate. Coffee cherries in later colonial periods. Tobacco leaves. While these might not always be stolen for immediate personal consumption, in the same way as a loaf of bread, their theft was still a serious crime against property, often the property of very powerful and influential landowners or merchants. And finally, there were stored and processed foods. Grain held in communal or private granaries, a prime target for desperate, hungry people, especially during famines. Dried or salted meat and fish sacks of flour, jars of wine or olive oil, often imported and valuable in blocks of unrefined sugar. The theft of these processed or stored goods often implied a greater degree of premeditation or a larger scale of operation, and thus might attract harsher legal scrutiny. A mainstream historical fact is that colonial legal systems in South America, drawing heavily from their Iberian parent codes, like the Spanish Siete Partidas or the Portuguese Ordenações Filipinas, made clear and often quite detailed distinctions in the crime of theft based on several factors. These included the intrinsic value of the stolen goods, the manner in which the theft was committed, e.g., simple, stealthy theft, hurto in Spanish, versus robbery involving violence or the threat of force. Robo, the location from which the item was stolen, e.g., from an open field versus a locked storehouse or a sacred place like a church. And crucially, the social status of both the perpetrator and the victim. All these elements would be weighed in determining the specific nature of the transgression and the appropriate, often severe punishment. The concept of value was critical. Stealing something deemed of vile or minimal value might result in a relatively minor penalty, perhaps a whipping or a short period in the stocks for public humiliation. But if the stolen food item or the quantity of it crossed a certain threshold of value, and those thresholds were often defined in the law codes, perhaps in terms of maravedis or real Spanish currency units, or their equivalent in goods, then the crime escalated to a more serious category, potentially grand larceny, attracting far harsher punishments like prolonged forced labor, branding mutilation, or even in some circumstances the death penalty. In colonial South America, the legal definition of food theft was probably quite broad and subject to some rather flexible interpretation by the local magistrate. Did you perchance gaze upon that esteemed viceroy's prize-winning imported Spanish papaya with an excessive degree of covetous longing in your eyes, thereby spiritually diminishing its juiciness? A stern-faced colonial judge might inquire. That sounds dangerously close to premeditated fruit-related thought crime, my friend. 10 lashes for impertinence and a very stern public lecture on the theological implications of coveting thy neighbor's extremely expensive tropical produce. Historians who specialize in the socio-economic conditions of colonial South America continue to debate the extent to which formal colonial laws defining and penalizing food theft were primarily designed to rigorously protect the private property and economic interests of the colonial elite, the church and the crown, versus the degree to which they might also have, at least in some theoretical or localized instances, reflected broader societal concerns about maintaining public order, ensuring a degree of food security for the entire community. However unequally that food was actually distributed in practice, or even upholding abstract principles of justice, especially when such laws were applied to starving, marginalized, or systematically oppressed populations. Was sheer demonstrable hunger ever considered a mitigating factor in cases of food theft in formal colonial law? Rarely, if ever. The legal systems were designed first and foremost to protect property rights and hunger. However desperate, did not typically absolve one of a crime against property. However, on a more local, informal level, a particularly compassionate priest, a lenient magistrate, though these were likely thin on the ground, or even a community consensus, might sometimes lead to a degree of unofficial leniency for truly desperate acts of minor pilfering, especially if the victim was also of humble means. But one certainly couldn't rely on it. The official stance was that theft was theft, and the law must be upheld. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some colonial regulations or local customary laws might have had incredibly specific, almost comically detailed rules about what constituted permissible gleaning, the traditional right of the poor to collect leftover ears of grain or fallen fruit from fields after the main harvest was complete, versus what constituted outright punishable theft from those same fields before or during the harvest. The line between a starving peasant legally gleaning a few fallen kernels and illegally pilfering a handful of standing corn could be incredibly thin, often arbitrarily drawn and very dangerously enforced by watchful overseers or landowners. Trying to argue finders keepers with a sack of freshly harvested maize you just happened to find temptingly unattended in the middle of the local governor's private, well-guarded granary Nice-Try area. Nice-Try. The colonial judges, after a brief theatrical consultation of their voluminous law books, possibly while enjoying a light snack of confiscated pastries, probably had a special cuneiform. I mean, a very elegant quill and ink stamp that just said in impressively ornate script, "Nope, definitely guilty. Next hungry peasant, please bring your own sacrificial goat for the pre-sentencing omen reading." The transgression of food theft then was seen through multiple lenses. It was a crime against private property, a disruption of the social order, an affront to the authority of the colonial state and its landowning elite, and if the food was taken from a church or involved sacred offerings, a sin against God himself. Understanding this multi-layered definition of the crime is crucial as we prepare to explore the often peculiar and invariably quite severe penalties that awaited those caught in its desperate, hungry embrace. You are now well-versed, Ageria, in the intricate, often rather draconian, legal frameworks that govern colonial South America under the dominion of Spain and Portugal. You understand that food in all its forms, from a humble ear of maize to a prize bullock, was considered valuable property, and its theft a serious transgression against the meticulously constructed, if deeply unequal, colonial order. The laws were clear, the potential penalties severe. But to truly grasp the prevalence of food theft and the often peculiar nature of the punishments designed to deter it, we must now turn our sleepy gaze from the dusty legal tomes to the harsh, often heartbreaking socioeconomic realities that frequently left vast segments of the population with empty bellies and consequently desperate hands. For behind many a stolen cassava root or pilfered handful of beans lay the grim, undeniable motivation of profound, life-threatening hunger. The colonial South American landscape, as we've touched upon, was one of stark and brutal contrasts. While the tables of viceroys, wealthy hacendados, powerful church officials, and successful merchants might groan under the weight of imported European delicacies and the exotic bounty of the New World, a very different reality existed for the majority. A mainstream historical fact is that the colonial economic systems imposed by Spain and Portugal, including vast forced labor regimes like the Andean Maita, which compelled indigenous communities to send laborers to toil in the silver mines of places like Potosi, under horrific conditions, and the widespread institution of plantation slavery, which fueled the sugar, cacao, coffee, and cotton industries, particularly in Brazil and the Caribbean-facing coasts, frequently resulted in severe malnutrition, chronic food insecurity, and recurrent periods of acute famine for the indigenous and enslaved African populations, who formed the overwhelming bulk of the labor force. Their own traditional food systems were often disrupted or destroyed. Their access to land for subsistence farming severely curtailed, and the rations they received from their masters or colonial administrators were typically meager, monotonous, and woefully insufficient to sustain a healthy life, especially given the backbreaking labor demanded of them. The colonial administration, it often seemed, had a very clear list of priorities. Number 1, the silver mines of Potosi must continue to produce vast quantities of wealth for the Spanish crown at all costs. Number 2, the sugar plantations of Brazil must flourish and provide endless sweet delight for the European market. Number 3, the viceroy's personal chef must have uninterrupted access to the finest imported figs and the plumpest local capons for tonight's rather important state dinner. The fact that approximately half the colonial workforce is currently subsisting on a diet of hope, a few wilted leaves, and the occasional rather dubiously acquired turnip, that's a minor logistical detail we'll address at some point. Or, possibly never if it proves too inconvenient for points 1, 2, and 3. It wasn't just the enslaved and the forcibly conscripted indigenous laborers who faced this gnawing hunger. Poorer European colonists, newly arrived immigrants with no land or connections, discharged soldiers, marginalized mestizos and mulattoes living on the fringes of colonial society all could find themselves struggling to secure enough food to survive, especially in rapidly growing, often poorly supplied urban centers or during periods of drought, crop failure, or economic downturn. In such a desperate environment, Egeria, where your children might be crying from hunger and your own stomach aches with an emptiness that gnaws at your very spirit, the sight of food, any food, belonging to someone else, perhaps seemingly unguarded in a marketplace growing in a field or stored in a less than secure outbuilding, could become an almost irresistible temptation. The severe penalties for theft, which we will explore in more detail, were certainly known. The fear of the lash, the pillory, the branding iron, or even death was very real. But the immediate agonizing reality of starvation, or watching your family starve, could often be a far more powerful, more primal motivator. When your primary options, on any given day, are I slowly, agonizingly starve to death, while maintaining impeccable respect for colonial property laws, or B, risk getting very thoroughly flogged and possibly worse for liberating a single life-sustaining loaf of bread from the local bakery. Suddenly, that loaf of bread starts to look incredibly appealing, and the potential for a future flogging just seems like a rather bothersome, if undeniably painful, administrative hurdle on the path to not being quite so existentially hungry anymore. Historians and sociologists who study the lived experiences of subaltern populations in colonial South America continue to analyze and debate the complex and often overlapping motivations behind acts of food theft, with some emphasizing it primarily as an individual or household strategy for sheer physical survival in the face of systemic deprivation, while others also highlight its potential role as a form of covert everyday social protest, a small act of resistance against perceived colonial exploitation, or even an attempt to assert alternative non-colonial moral economies, concerning the fundamental right of access to basic sustenance, especially when faced with the conspicuous and often hoarded abundance of the elite. The targets of these desperate hands were often dictated by accessibility and opportunity. A few ears of maize or sweet potatoes snatched from the edge of a vast plantation field under cover of darkness. A piece of dried fish, or a handful of beans pilfered from a market stall when the vendor's back was turned. Chickens or a small pig spirited away from a poorly secured pen. These were common acts of petty theft, often committed by individuals or small family groups pushed to the brink. But sometimes food theft took on a more organized, or at least more audacious character. Runaway slave communities known as quilombos in Brazil or palenques in Spanish America, which formed hidden settlements in remote, inaccessible areas, often survived by launching raids on nearby plantations or haciendas to acquire food tools and weapons. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that these quilombos and palenques were not just desperate, disorganized bands of fugitives. Some of them became remarkably stable, self-sufficient communities with their own agricultural systems, social structures, and even fortifications, viewing their raids on colonial property not as theft, but as a righteous reclamation of resources and a continuation of their resistance against the brutal system of enslavement that had dispossessed them in the first place. Indigenous communities, too, pushed off their ancestral lands, their traditional farming cycles disrupted, and forced to pay crippling tributes and produce to their colonial overlords, might resort to secretly harvesting forbidden crops from lands that were once theirs, or raiding colonial storehouses in times of extreme famine. For them, such acts might have been framed not as theft, but as a desperate attempt to reclaim what was rightfully theirs, or simply to survive in a world turned upside down by conquest and colonial exploitation. For many in colonial South America, that tempting, forbidden fruit wasn't some mystical, divinely protected apple in a mythical Garden of Eden. It was just a perfectly ordinary earthly potato or a nice bunch of bananas growing in the hacendado's field. A field that might well have been their own community's ancestral land just a generation or two before. And that fruit was forbidden to them now simply because they were starving and the colonial master owned everything, including, it often seemed, their hunger itself. The psychological impact of chronic hunger and food insecurity on these populations would have been profound, shaping their daily anxieties, their social interactions, and their relationship with the colonial authorities who controlled their access to this most basic necessity of life. It created a climate of desperation where the line between law-abiding subject and criminal food thief could become perilously thin, blurred by the gnawing ache of an empty belly and the powerful primal instinct for survival. Understanding this grim reality, Ageria is essential as we prepare to examine the often peculiar and invariably quite severe ways in which the colonial legal system sought to punish those who dared to take a forbidden bite. You are now deeply aware, Ageria, of the stark, often brutal socioeconomic realities that permeated colonial South America. You've seen how the vast disparities in wealth and access to resources, particularly food, could drive ordinary people. Enslaved Africans, subjugated indigenous laborers, marginalized colonists, to the desperate act of theft simply to survive. You also understand that the Iberian colonial powers had established complex legal frameworks emphasizing property rights and social hierarchy, which defined such acts not as unfortunate consequences of systemic inequality, but as punishable crimes against the established order. So what happened when a hungry hand, driven by an empty belly, reached out and took a forbidden morsel? Let's begin by exploring the peculiar penalties for what the authorities might have considered petty pilfering, the theft of small amounts of common food. Imagine yourself, Ageria, in this precarious position. Perhaps you are an indigenous woman whose family's traditional maize field has been encroached upon by a sprawling Spanish hacienda, and your children are crying from hunger. Or maybe you are an enslaved African on a Brazilian sugar plantation, your daily ration of beans and manioc flour woefully insufficient to fuel your back-breaking labor. Or you could be a recently arrived, impoverished European immigrant in a bustling colonial port city with no work and no means to buy bread. The gnawing ache in your stomach, or the sight of your child's listless eyes becomes unbearable. You see an opportunity, a few ears of maize left seemingly unattended at the edge of a vast field. A handful of cassava roots peeking from the earth in a planter's garden. a piece of dried fish momentarily unwatched on a market stall. The act itself is swift, driven by immediate desperate need rather than by any grand criminal design. You liberated a slightly bruised but perfectly edible mango from the very edge of Don Alejandro's vast, sprawling, and frankly rather ostentatiously excessive mango orchard. In your defense, it looked incredibly lonely, just hanging there practically begging to be eaten. In Don Alejandro's defense, and more importantly, in the eyes of colonial law, it was his lonely mango, and he had very specific proprietary plans for it, probably involving a rather fancy fruit salad to which you most definitely were not invited. This is petty pilfering. The value of the stolen item in the grand scheme of colonial wealth is minimal. Yet the transgression in the eyes of the authorities and property owners is not necessarily seen as trivial. A mainstream historical fact is that for minor offenses like petty food theft in colonial South America, punishments were often summary, public, and designed to be a swift deterrent. There might not be a lengthy, formal trial with bewigged judges and eloquent lawyers, especially if you, the accused, were from the lower rungs of the social ladder. An indigenous person, an enslaved individual, or a landless peasant. Justice, or what passed for it, could be meted out quickly by a local magistrate, a plantation overseer, a corregidor, a Spanish colonial official, or even just the aggrieved property owner himself, particularly if the thief was caught in the act. What kind of penalties awaited these desperate minor food thieves? Public humiliation was a very common and deeply effective form of punishment. The aim was not just to chastise you, the offender, but to make an example of you, to shame you before your community, and to discourage others from similar acts. You might find yourself confined in the stock sipo or the pillory pacota in the central plaza of the town for hours or even days. Imagine being locked in your head and hands or feet, trapped in the unyielding wood, exposed to the elements. The scorching sun, the chilling night air, the sudden downpours. You would be subjected to the jeers, the taunts, and the contemptuous gazes of passers-by. Children might throw rotten fruit or stones. It was a profoundly degrading and uncomfortable experience. Congratulations on your recent conviction for unauthorized cassava acquisition in the first degree. Your grand prize and an all-expenses-paid multi-hour extended stay in the town square pillory. Do enjoy the glorious sunshine, the refreshing open air. The occasional thoughtfully lobbed rotten vegetable courtesy of a passing morally outraged urchin. And of course, that profound and inescapable sense of deep public shame. It's a very immersive, if somewhat olfactorily challenging form of colonial justice designed to be memorable. Other shaming rituals might involve being paraded through the streets, perhaps with a stolen item. That single cassava root, those few ears of maize, hung around your neck like a badge of infamy, or with a sign detailing your crime for all to read, assuming they could read, of course. The visual impact was often enough. You might be forced to wear a pregón, a public crier announcing your offense. Some communities had specific, often rather degrading nicknames or labels that would be publicly attached to individuals known for petty theft, further entrenching their social marginalization long after any physical punishment had healed. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that this public shaming wasn't just about individual punishment. It was a way for the community to collectively reaffirm its moral boundaries and its respect for property rights, all performed on the unfortunate stage of your public disgrace. It was like a very grim, very real colonial reality TV show where the unwilling contestant always lost and the prize was universal social condemnation. Corporal punishment, even for minor food thefts, was also depressingly common. Flogging or whipping was a go-to penalty for a vast array of offenses in the colonial world. The number of lashes would vary depending on the perceived severity of the theft your social status enslaved. Individuals often received far more brutal whippings than even poor colonists for similar offenses, and the mood of the person administering the punishment. Being beaten with a heavy stick or a hardened leather rod was another possibility. The colonial authorities, and indeed many private property owners, generally believed that nothing quite said, "Please refrain from stealing that rather tempting loaf of freshly baked bread in the future." Quite like the immediate, painful, and very public spectacle of watching someone else get enthusiastically and often quite bloodily flogged for stealing a previous loaf of bread. It was a very direct, if undeniably brutal form of public service announcement, broadcast live and in person. The degree to which the prescribed severity of these punishments for petty food theft in colonial South America was consistently applied across different vast regions from the Andean highlands to the Brazilian coast. and by different levels of judicial or administrative authorities, versus being subject to wide local variations based on specific socioeconomic conditions at the time, such as during a famine when desperation was higher. The particular identity and social connections of both the thief and the victim, and the personal discretion, or even caprice of individual magistrates, plantation overseers or landowners, is a complex and often difficult question for legal and social historians to precisely quantify. For repeat offenders of petty theft, or if the stolen food item was deemed slightly more valuable than just a handful of beans, the penalties might escalate. Short periods of forced labor, perhaps cleaning public latrines, repairing roads, or other menial, unpleasant tasks could be imposed. Fines were also a possibility, but this was often a rather pointless punishment for those who were stealing food precisely because they were too destitute to afford it in the first place. The overarching goal of these swift public and often physically painful penalties for even minor food thefts was clear deterrence. It was about reinforcing the sanctity of private property, especially colonial private property, maintaining the rigid social hierarchy and instilling fear in those marginalized populations who might be tempted by hunger to challenge the established order, even in such a small, desperate way. The peculiar nature of many of these punishments lay not just in their harshness, but in their deliberate theatricality, their focus on public shame as a tool of social control. Your stolen cassava root Egeria might have momentarily eased your hunger, but its discovery could lead to a very public, very painful, and deeply humiliating lesson in the power dynamics of colonial South America. You've now witnessed Egeria, the rather public, often humiliating, and sometimes physically painful consequences that awaited those desperate souls in colonial South America who were caught engaging in what the authorities deemed petty pilfering of food. A stolen cassava root here, a handful of maize there. The pillory, the lash, the shaming rituals, all designed to deter and to reinforce the sanctity of property, however meager the stolen item might seem to us from our comfortable temporal distance. But what happened when the stolen food wasn't just a few easily concealed vegetables or a quickly devoured loaf of bread? What if the object of a hungry person's, or perhaps a more organized thief's desire, had 4 legs, a distinct mubea or grunt, and represented a far more significant economic investment for its owner? We now turn our sleepy yet slightly apprehensive gaze towards the far more serious crime of livestock theft or rustling, and the correspondingly severe, and often quite peculiar penalties that came with it. In the agricultural and pastoral economies of colonial South America, livestock was far more than just a walking source of potential Sunday roast. A mainstream historical fact is that domesticated animals, cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats, introduced from Europe alongside indigenous Andean camelids like llamas and alpacas, were incredibly valuable assets. They provided not only meat, milk, cheese, and other dairy products, but also wool and hides for clothing and other essential goods. Animal power for plowing fields and transporting goods, especially oxen and llamas, and a crucial form of stored wealth and capital. Owning large herds of cattle on the sprawling estancias of the Rio de la Plata, or flocks of sheep and llamas in the high Andean punas, was a clear and unambiguous sign of wealth status and power for colonial landowners, the hacendados and fazenderos. In colonial South America, Egeria, a healthy breeding cow, wasn't just a cow. It was a walking, mooing, milk-producing, cheese-generating, leather-providing, future steak and stew-creating, multi-generational investment portfolio with a built-in fertilizer spreader. You steal someone's prize cow, especially if that someone is a powerful don with a very short temper and excellent connections to the local magistrate. You're not just considered a common petty thief. You're an economic terrorist, a direct threat to their prosperity, and the penalties you can be quite sure will be designed to be memorably and probably quite painfully unpleasant. The crime of livestock theft, known in Spanish legal tradition as abigeato, was therefore viewed with extreme seriousness by colonial authorities and property owners alike. This wasn't typically an opportunistic snatch and grab by a starving individual in the marketplace. Stealing livestock, especially larger animals like cattle or horses, often required a greater degree of planning skill and sometimes even the cooperation of several individuals. It might involve venturing onto private grazing lands, often at night, skillfully separating animals from a herd, and then attempting to drive them away or butcher them discreetly. The economic impact on the victim was also far more significant than the loss of a few ears of corn. Losing even one ox could cripple a small farmer's ability to plow his fields. Losing several head of cattle could be a major financial blow to a larger landowner. Consequently, the penalties for rustling were correspondingly and often dramatically more severe than those for petty food pilfering. If a public flogging of, say, 20 or 30 lashes was the common currency for stealing a chicken or a sack of potatoes, then being caught red-handed with Don Rodrigo's prize-winning merino ram might earn you a sentence involving 100 lashes, or even more often administered with such brutality that it could leave the victim permanently maimed or even prove fatal. The exact degree to which penalties for livestock theft were meticulously standardized across the vast and geographically diverse territories of colonial South America versus being significantly influenced by powerful local economic conditions. For example, the perceived intrinsic value and economic importance of cattle in a dedicated ranching area of the Pampas versus that of llamas in the high Andes. The specific social status and influence of the involved parties, both the thief and the unfortunate owner of the purloined animal, and the varying effectiveness and judicial leanings of often quite isolated colonial judicial enforcement bodies, is a complex subject that legal and economic historians continue to explore through detailed regional archival research and comparative legal studies. Beyond intensified corporal punishment, other more permanent and peculiar penalties might come into play for livestock thieves. Branding, a practice commonly used to mark ownership on the animals themselves, was sometimes also applied to human rustlers as a mark of their crime and a lifelong badge of shame and criminality. Imagine being branded with a specific symbol, perhaps a stylized representation of a cow or a sheep, or the initial of the landowner you stole from. A permanent public declaration of your transgression. Mutilation. The horrific practice of cutting off a hand, usually, the right hand the offending limb for theft, an ear or even the nose was a legally sanctioned punishment for serious theft in some ancient and medieval European law codes that formed the background to Iberian colonial law, while its widespread systematic application, specifically for livestock theft in colonial South America, is something scholars might debate the frequency of it, certainly existed as a potential and terrifying penalty in the broader legal arsenal, especially for repeat offenders or those deemed particularly egregious in their rustling activities. It served as both a brutal punishment and a chillingly effective visual deterrent to others. Forced labor, often in its harshest forms, was another common fate for convicted livestock thieves. You might be condemned to years or even a lifetime of grueling, dangerous work in the infamous silver mines of Potosí in Upper Peru, modern Bolivia, or the mercury mines of Huancavelica, where life expectancy was terrifyingly short. Or perhaps you'd be sent to an obraje, one of the notorious colonial textile workshops where indigenous and other forced laborers toiled in often squalid prison-like conditions for incredibly long hours. Exile to a remote, disease-ridden presidio, a fortified military outpost on a dangerous frontier, was another possibility, effectively a slow death sentence for many. So, you're contemplating a life of crime in colonial Peru, Algeria, weighing your career options. Option A: discreetly pilfer a few slightly bruised potatoes from the edge of a field. Risk a rather public and uncomfortable flogging if caught. Option B: attempt to abscond with Don Diego de la Vega y Monte Cristo's entire prize-winning herd of exceptionally fluffy and valuable alpaca. Risk being sent to the Potosi silver mines for a rather more character-building and likely significantly shorter 20-year stint of extremely hard labor in the dark. Choose wisely, future prospective inmate of the colonial penal system. And yes, for large-scale rustling, for being a notorious or repeat offender. Or if your act of livestock theft involved violence against a herdsman or overseer, thus escalating it to robo with aggravating circumstances, capital punishment was a very real possibility. Hanging was a common method of execution in the colonies, often carried out publicly to maximize its deterrent effect. The enforcement of these laws and the pursuit of livestock thieves would also have been far more vigorous than for minor food pilferers. Landowners whose wealth and livelihood depended on their herds would be highly motivated to track down and punish rustlers. They might employ armed guards, vaqueros, or gauchos. In some regions were not just herders but also formidable protectors of livestock, or form armed posses to hunt down suspected thieves. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in some remote frontier areas of colonial South America, where formal legal structures were weak or distant, suspected livestock thieves might be subjected to summary extrajudicial justice by vigilante groups of ranchers or powerful landowners, often bypassing the colonial courts altogether. This frontier justice could be incredibly swift, brutal, and entirely outside the written law, though it often had the tacit approval of local elites who saw it as a necessary means of protecting their property in an unruly environment. If you were an enslaved person or an indigenous laborer forced to work on a hacienda or estancia and you were caught stealing livestock from your master or the estate, your fate would likely be even harsher. This would be seen not just as theft, but as an act of gross insubordination and rebellion against the established colonial and master-slave hierarchy, and punished with exemplary, terrifying severity. The peculiar penalties for food thieves in colonial South America clearly escalated dramatically when that food had 4 legs, a significant monetary value, and a very, very angry owner. If you were caught attempting to liberate a few prize llamas from an Andean corral, they probably didn't just politely ask you to return them and write a heartfelt apology note. They might make you carry the surprisingly heavy and undoubtedly very indignant llama back to its rightful owner on your own shoulders, then perhaps publicly apologize to the llama itself for the emotional distress and inconvenience caused. And then, just for good measure, brand you with a tiny, artistically rendered but very permanent llama-shaped symbol of your profound and lasting shame. Beware the llama lifter. The brand might silently proclaim to all who saw it, his crimes were woolly, but his punishment was just... You've now felt the sting, Egeria, of colonial justice as it was meted out for the theft of precious livestock in ancient South America. We've seen how rustling a cow or a llama was considered a far graver offense than pilfering a few ears of maize, often leading to brutal floggings, permanent branding, or even long, soul-crushing terms of forced labor in the deadly mines or oppressive textile workshops. The message was clear: the economic assets of the colonial elite were to be fiercely protected. But what happened when the scale of food theft, or indeed the theft of valuable agricultural commodities, escalated beyond individual acts of desperation or small-scale rustling? What if organized groups dared to raid the very engines of colonial wealth, the sprawling plantations and haciendas that produced sugar, cacao, coffee, and other lucrative export crops, or that maintained vast herds of livestock? Now, Egeria, you'll explore the truly perilous risks and the exceptionally severe, often quite terrifyingly peculiar punishments that awaited those who engaged in such large-scale plantation raids. Imagine, if you will, the vast agricultural estates that dominated so much of the colonial South American landscape. In Brazil, these were the immense sugar plantations, the engenhos powered by the brutal labor of enslaved Africans, producing the white gold that enriched Portugal. In the Spanish Andean regions, they were the sprawling haciendas, often carved out of former indigenous communal lands, producing grains, livestock, and other goods for the colonial market. In the tropical lowlands, plantations might cultivate cacao, tobacco, or later coffee. These were not just farms, they were economic powerhouses, the very foundation of colonial wealth and imperial revenue. They were often heavily fortified, or at least well guarded by armed overseers, private militias, employed by the landowners, or even detachments of colonial troops, if they were particularly large or strategically important. Trying to launch a successful raid on a well-defended colonial sugar plantation, Egeria was like attempting to sneak into the heavily guarded imperial treasury in Seville, armed only with a rather blunt sugarcane machete and an overly optimistic attitude. They generally had significantly more than just a grumpy night watchman and a slightly leaky fence. There were overseers, often notoriously brutal armed guards, probably a pack of very large, very unfriendly dogs with exceptionally big teeth, and an absolutely zero-tolerance policy for anyone caught eyeing their precious sugarcane, their fattened cattle, or their stores of valuable export commodities with anything less than pure, unadulterated, and entirely distant admiration. Who would dare to undertake such a perilous venture? The primary perpetrators of these larger-scale raids were often, as we've touched upon, communities of runaway slaves. These were the Quilombos of Brazil, like the famous Palmares or the Palenques of Spanish America. Hidden fortified settlements established deep in remote forests, mountains or swamps by Africans who had escaped the horrors of bondage. A mainstream historical fact is that organized raids on colonial plantations and haciendas frequently carried out by these resilient communities of self-liberated enslaved people, were considered exceptionally grave threats to the colonial economic order and the very stability of the slave system. For these quilombolas, or cimarrones as runaway slaves were sometimes called, raiding plantations was not just about acquiring food for immediate survival. It was an act of resistance, a way to provision their independent communities to acquire tools and weapons to liberate other enslaved people and to strike a blow against their former oppressors. Other groups might also engage in such raids. Dispossessed indigenous communities, driven from their ancestral lands and pushed to the margins, might launch attacks on colonial estates to reclaim resources or as a form of desperate retaliation. Bands of outlaws or bandoleros composed perhaps of army deserters, impoverished colonists, or mixed-race individuals excluded from the mainstream colonial economy might also see plantations as lucrative targets. The extent to which raids on colonial estates by these various marginalized groups were primarily driven by immediate subsistence needs versus being consciously politically motivated acts of sustained resistance against the entire colonial system, and how colonial authorities themselves differentiated, or more often failed to differentiate, between these complex motivations and their often undiscriminatingly brutal punitive responses, is a complex and vital area of ongoing study in the social and resistance history of colonial South America. The targets of these raids were diverse. Certainly food stores, granaries filled with maize or wheat pens of livestock fields of ripening crops were primary objectives. But raiders might also seek valuable tools, iron implements, weapons, especially firearms and gunpowder. If they could get them horses, clothing, and even luxury goods that could be used by the community or traded. And very significantly, they often sought to liberate other enslaved people, swelling their own numbers and further challenging the colonial slave regime. The risks involved in such an undertaking were, of course, astronomically high. Getting caught during a plantation raid was not like being found with a few illicitly acquired potatoes in your pocket. This was often seen by the colonial authorities not merely as theft, but as armed insurrection, as rebellion, as economic sabotage threatening the very foundations of their power and prosperity. Consequently, the punishments were designed to be exceptionally severe, a terrifying spectacle to crush any spirit of resistance and deter any future attempts. If captured plantation raiders, especially if they were identified as runaway slaves or leaders of such communities, faced an almost certain and often particularly gruesome death. Capital punishment, by public hanging, garroting, or sometimes even more brutal methods like being burned alive or quartered, though the latter was usually reserved for the most high-profile leaders of major revolts or conspiracies, was common. A quirky or fringe tidbit, though a grim one, is that some particularly notorious leaders of quilombos or major slave revolts who were eventually captured and executed, such as Zumbi of Palmares in late 17th century Brazil, became legendary figures of resistance. Colonial authorities often went to extreme lengths to display their dismembered bodies or severed heads in public places. A horrific tactic designed to terrorize the enslaved population and extinguish any lingering hopes of successful rebellion. We will, of course, Ageria, pass over the more explicit details of such displays in our sleepy narrative, focusing instead on the fact of their exemplary terror-inducing intent. Torture was also frequently employed not just as a punishment in itself, but to extract information from captured raiders, the location of their hidden settlements, the names of other participants, plans for future actions. The methods of torture were as varied as they were cruel, designed to inflict maximum pain and break the will of the captive. For enslaved individuals caught participating in a raid who were not immediately executed, the fate was often a return to an even more brutal form of enslavement. They might be sold away from their families to a particularly harsh master, or a notoriously deadly mining region, subjected to relentless floggings or forced to wear heavy iron collars or chains as a permanent mark of their transgression and a warning to others. The colonial landowners and authorities had a very specific and rather limited definition of sharing their bounty. It usually involves something along the lines of, you, the enslaved or coerced laborer, will perform all the backbreaking, life-shortening work required to cultivate and harvest these precious commodities. And I, the divinely appointed landowner, will graciously accept all the profits and enjoy a remarkably comfortable lifestyle as a result. Anyone who attempted to share in this colonial bounty by, say, independently liberating a few sacks of freshly harvested cacao beans or a string of particularly well-fattened pigs was promptly and forcefully introduced to a very different, much less generous, and far more painful kind of colonial sharing. The sharing of exceptionally peculiar and deeply unpleasant punishments. The line between a food thief driven by simple hunger and a rebel or bandit engaged in a plantation raid was often deliberately blurred by the colonial authorities. Any organized taking of property from the colonial elite, especially if it involved groups of enslaved or indigenous people, was frequently framed as an act of sedition, justifying the most extreme and violent repressive measures. If you were unfortunate enough to be captured during a raid on a powerful hacendado's estate, the colonial authorities weren't likely to just give you a stern talking to and a modest fine payable in slightly damaged llamas. It was much more like receiving an immediate, non-refundable express ticket to the peculiar and extremely unpleasant punishments R Us Emporium, with a very high statistical probability of not qualifying for the return journey, or indeed any journey at all, other than perhaps one to the gallows or the bottom of a very deep, very dark mine shaft. The stakes when challenging the economic heart of the colonial enterprise were terrifyingly absolute. You have now witnessed Egeria, the escalating scale of retribution in colonial South America for those who dared to steal food. From the public shame and stinging lashes meted out for petty pilfering of a few ears of maize, to the brutal, often lethal consequences faced by those who engaged in organized raids on the vast plantations and haciendas that formed the economic backbone of the Iberian empires. The message was stark: property, especially the property of the colonial elite, was to be defended with uncompromising severity. But what happened if the stolen sustenance was not just secular property, but was deemed sacred, belonging to or consecrated by that other immensely powerful institution in colonial Latin America, the Holy Catholic Church? This Egeria was an entirely different category of transgression, one that offended not just the earthly powers of the crown and the landowners, but the divine authority of God himself, and often incurred particularly harsh and sometimes quite peculiar penalties. In colonial South America, the Catholic Church was far more than just a spiritual institution. It was a dominant social, political, economic, and cultural force. A mainstream historical fact is that the Church owned vast tracts of land, operated lucrative agricultural estates, and missions controlled significant wealth through tithes, and bequests. And its clergy often wielded considerable temporal power alongside their spiritual authority. Churches, cathedrals, monasteries, convents, and mission stations dotted the colonial landscape, from the grandest vice-regal capitals to the most remote frontier settlements. And the property belonging to these sacred institutions, including their food stores, their livestock, their agricultural produce, and any items directly used in religious worship, was considered sacrosanct, protected not just by earthly law, but by divine injunction. So what constituted sacred sustenance, the theft of which would elevate a common crime to the far more grievous offense of sacrilege? Sacrilegio in Spanish and Portuguese. This could include several categories. Firstly, there were the direct food offerings made to the church or for religious purposes. This might be the tithe, the 1/10 of agricultural produce that colonists and sometimes coerced indigenous communities were obligated to give to the church. It could be first fruits, the choicest portion of a harvest dedicated to God. It might even be food items left as offerings at specific shrines for saints or for use in particular religious festivals and charitable distributions, though the latter, if stolen, was seen as doubly heinous, robbing both God and the poor. Stealing from Don Diego's private, impressively well-stocked pantry because you were starving. A very bad idea, likely to result in some thoroughly unpleasant earthly justice. Stealing the blessed communion wafers from the church sanctuary, or perhaps liberating the prize-winning sacrificial goat that was being lovingly fattened up for the bishop's upcoming Easter feast, that, my friend, was an express ticket to a whole different dimension of trouble. A skip the local magistrate, go directly to excommunication. Do not pass. Go, do not collect 200 silver reales, and prepare for both temporal and eternal damnation kind of offense. The church, you see, did not mess around when it came to its sacred snacks, or indeed any of its divinely protected property. Secondly, there were the substantial food stores and livestock belonging directly to churches, monasteries, convents, or mission outposts. These institutions often controlled large agricultural enterprises, their granaries filled with wheat and maize, their cellars with wine and olive oil, their pastures grazed by herds of cattle and flocks of sheep, all intended to support the clergy. The religious orders, the upkeep of the sacred buildings, and at least in theory, charitable works within the community. To steal from these consecrated storehouses was not just depriving the priests of their dinner, it was seen as plundering the very patrimony of God. The penalties for such sacrilegious theft were, as you might expect, exceptionally severe, often far harsher than for comparable theft from a secular individual, or even from the crown itself. The crime was compounded. It was theft, yes, but it was also an act of profound disrespect, a profanation of holy things, an offense against the divine majesty. The full weight of both secular colonial law and ecclesiastical church law could be brought to bear upon the unfortunate culprit. One of the most terrifying spiritual penalties, often wielded by the church for grave offenses like sacrilege, was excommunication. In an era where society was so deeply and universally Catholic, to be excommunicated was to be cast out not just from the sacraments and spiritual comforts of the church, but often from the very fabric of social life itself. It was a kind of spiritual death sentence, isolating the individual and marking them as an unholy pariah. Beyond the spiritual, the physical punishments were also ratcheted up. Flogging would likely be administered with particular severity, perhaps within the precincts of the church or marketplace, for maximum public humiliation and edification. The extent to which accusations of sacrilegious theft in colonial South America were always based on entirely genuine, clear-cut offenses against demonstrably sacred church property, versus occasionally being strategically employed by either ecclesiastical or secular authorities as a convenient pretext to persecute individuals or groups already deemed troublesome, potentially heretical, or perhaps resistant to full colonial religious assimilation and control, is a complex and sensitive issue that requires very careful critical analysis of specific historical court records, local power dynamics, and the broader socio-religious context of the time. In particularly egregious cases, especially if the theft involved consecrated items like communion vessels, even if they were just being used to illicitly drink stolen altar wine or was combined with other acts of desecration, more extreme penalties could be invoked. While burning at the stake was typically reserved for unrepentant heretics, flagrant witches, or those guilty of the most heinous forms of blasphemy, certain forms of sacrilege, if deemed sufficiently diabolical, might push an offender perilously close to such a fate, especially if the local Inquisition decided to take a particularly keen interest in the case. The Holy Office of the Inquisition, while its primary focus was on policing doctrinal purity and stamping out heresy, could certainly become involved in investigating and punishing severe cases of sacrilege, viewing them as attacks on the foundations of the faith. If your ill-advised attempt to pilfer food from a monastery kitchen was somehow reinterpreted by an overly zealous inquisitor as a deliberate act of satanic defiance against the Church Universal, you might suddenly find yourself facing a rather more intense and significantly less gentle form of inquiry into your dietary habits and spiritual affiliations. Their idea of a gentle persuasion to confess often involved rather less gentle methods and a distinct lack of concern for your future picnic plans, or indeed any future plans at all. A quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights the meticulousness with which the Church guarded its assets is that surviving colonial ecclesiastical records sometimes contain incredibly detailed inventories of church property, right down to the last candlestick or chicken. There are also records of church officials pursuing legal action with great zeal and persistence to recover even relatively minor stolen items, like a few measures of grain from a mission storehouse or some altar cloths, not just because of the material loss, but as a matter of upholding sacred authority and deterring any further disrespect for church property. The Heavenly Accounting Department and its earthly representatives were clearly keeping very careful ledgers. You can almost imagine a special celestial ledger specifically for theft of sacred foodstuffs and other divinely consecrated consumables. Column A. Item stolen, e.g., 3 blessed slightly stale empanadas from the sacristy. Column B. Prescribed earthly punishment, e.g., 50 lashes administered with a specially consecrated scourge followed by public repentance in a particularly itchy sackcloth garment for 3 consecutive market days, column C. Probable eternal consequences, e.g., an additional 700 millennia in purgatory with a strict, unchanging celestial diet of lukewarm holy water and profound, unceasing regret. The peculiar nature of these penalties for stealing sacred sustenance lay in this potent combination of temporal and spiritual punishment, the added layer of religious horror and divine retribution that transformed a common crime into an act of profound impiety. It was a clear message to the colonial populace while stealing from your fellow man was bad. Stealing from God or his earthly representatives was infinitely worse, an offense that could jeopardize not just your hide in this world, but your very soul in the next. You've now seen Ageria how the grand legal frameworks of imperial Spain and Portugal cast a long, stern shadow over colonial South America, defining what constituted food, what made its taking a transgression, and how even the theft of sacred sustenance from the powerful church could incur not just earthly punishment, but also the terrifying prospect of spiritual damnation. We've touched upon the desperate hunger that often drove people to risk these dire consequences, and we've glimpsed the escalating scale of penalties from the public shame of the pillory for petty pilfering to the brutal finality of execution for more organized raids on the plantations and haciendas that formed the economic heart of the colonies. But who were the individuals most likely to find themselves accused of these food-related crimes, their empty bellies leading their desperate hands into the unforgiving gears of colonial justice? As you might expect in such a rigidly hierarchical and deeply unequal society, the profile of a typical food thief was tragically almost invariably drawn from the most vulnerable, marginalized, and oppressed segments of the population. A mainstream historical fact is that in colonial South America, individuals from subjugated and dispossessed groups, most notably enslaved Africans, heavily exploited indigenous populations, and the growing numbers of impoverished, lower-class colonists or persons of mixed ancestry mestizos, mulattoes, were disproportionately accused, convicted, and punished for crimes like food theft. Their profound socio-economic vulnerability, often a direct result of the colonial system itself, coupled with systemic discrimination within that same colonial legal framework, made them far more likely to resort to such acts for sheer survival and significantly less able to defend themselves effectively against any charges brought, however minor or unjustly inflated. If there was a prize fighting cock mysteriously missing from the local magistrate's coop, or a suspiciously light sack of precious maize in the communal storehouse, the colonial authorities didn't exactly launch a full-scale Sherlock Holmes-style forensic investigation with meticulous fingerprint dusting and complex DNA analysis of stray chicken feathers. It was much more frequently a case of, right then, let's round up the usual suspects. You know, the ones who are systematically starved, routinely overworked, generally treated like slightly less valuable animate farming equipment, and who might just possibly have a vested interest in not perishing from acute malnutrition before their next back-breaking shift in the silver mine or the sugar field. I'm reasonably certain one of them must have done it, case closed more or less. Consider first the vast population of enslaved Africans toiling under the most brutal conditions on the sugar, cacao, coffee, and cotton plantations of Brazil and other parts of South America, or in the deadly gold and silver mines. The rations provided to them by their masters were notoriously inadequate, often just a bare minimum of coarse grains like manioc flour or maize, perhaps some dried beans, or salted meat, rarely enough to sustain the immense physical labor demanded of them. Chronic hunger and debilitating malnutrition were endemic. For an enslaved person, therefore, stealing food, perhaps some extra sugarcane from the field to chew for its meager sweetness, a few vegetables from the master's garden, a chicken from the coop, or even just a handful of grain from the plantation stores, was often not an act of common criminality, but a desperate, life-sustaining necessity, a way to supplement a diet designed to keep them barely alive but perpetually weak and dependent. It could also be, in some instances, a subtle or even overt act of resistance, a small reclaiming of the fruits of their own stolen labor. But if caught, their punishment would be exceptionally severe. They were, after all, considered property themselves, and stealing from the master was a dual offense: theft of goods and an act of insubordination by the master's chattel, threatening the very foundations of the slave system. Then there were the indigenous peoples of South America. The Spanish and Portuguese conquests had led to a widespread dispossession of their ancestral lands, the disruption of their traditional agricultural systems and foodways, and their forced incorporation into brutal labor regimes like the Andean Mita, a rotational forced labor system, particularly for the silver mines of Potosi, or the encomienda, a grant of indigenous labor in tribute to a Spanish colonist. Many indigenous communities were reduced to poverty, forced to pay heavy tributes in produce to their colonial overlords, and often left with insufficient food for their own survival. For an indigenous person to steal food, perhaps by hunting or foraging on lands that were once communally theirs but had now been claimed by a Spanish hacendado, or by taking back a portion of the crops they themselves had cultivated but which were destined for the colonial market or the tribute collector. This too was often an act born of desperation and a deep sense of injustice. Yet colonial law would view it simply as theft from a rightful European owner, or as a rebellious refusal to accept the new colonial order. The extent to which accusations of food theft against enslaved or indigenous individuals in colonial South America were consistently based on objectively verifiable acts of pilfering versus sometimes being fabricated, deliberately exaggerated by masters or colonial officials to exert greater control, to settle personal scores, to justify harsher labor demands, or even to legitimize the seizure of yet more communal land or resources, is a difficult but incredibly important question that historians specializing in subaltern studies and colonial legal history continue to critically examine, often through the challenging task of reading against the grain of inherently biased official court records and administrative reports. Even among the poorer European colonists, recent immigrants who had arrived with high hopes but found little opportunity. Landless peasants, unemployed artisans in the growing colonial towns, or marginalized individuals of mixed ancestry who often found themselves caught between worlds with few legal or economic protections. Hunger was a frequent companion. For them, too, the temptation to steal a loaf of bread from a bakery, some fruit from a market stall, or perhaps a bit of salted meat from a warehouse could be overwhelming when faced with starvation. While their legal standing might in theory have been slightly better than that of an enslaved African or a non-Christianized indigenous person, their poverty often meant they still faced the full, harsh brunt of colonial justice if caught. Your theoretical legal defense, if you were a starving Spanish peasant, brought before a bewigged colonial magistrate for the heinous crime of unauthorized turnip liberation, might be a heartfelt, "But, Your Excellency, my children haven't eaten in 3 days, and I was just incredibly hungry." The judge, after a long theatrical sigh and perhaps a delicate sip of imported sherry, paid for indirectly by the very system that was starving, you would probably clear his throat. Consult a very large and dusty legal tome, and then sentence you to 50 lashes for impertinent honesty on top of the original turnip-related charges. Justice was swift, and often remarkably unsympathetic to the concept of an empty stomach. The role of gender in these accusations of food theft is also worth a moment of sleepy contemplation. While men might be more likely to be involved in larger-scale rustling or plantation raids, women, particularly enslaved or impoverished women responsible for feeding their children, were frequently accused of petty pilfering from household stores, kitchens, or marketplaces. Their acts of theft were often directly tied to the immediate, desperate need to provide for their young. The punishments they faced could be just as severe, compounded by their generally more vulnerable legal and social position. It's a truly deeply peculiar and tragic system, Egeria, where the very people whose labor produced the vast agricultural wealth of the colonies, the sugar, the cacao, the coffee, the grains, the livestock, were often the ones most likely to be systematically starved and then brutally punished for attempting to take back even the smallest portion of that bounty merely to survive. The profile of the accused food thief in colonial South America is therefore not typically one of a hardened criminal or a malicious wrongdoer, but far more often the heartbreaking silhouette of a desperate human being caught in the unforgiving gears of an exploitative and profoundly unequal system. You've now seen Egeria with a heavy heart, the desperate faces of those most likely to be accused of food theft in colonial South America, the enslaved African toiling under the lash on a Brazilian sugar plantation, the dispossessed indigenous peasant struggling to feed their family in the Andean highlands, the impoverished mestizo or recently arrived European immigrant, adrift in a bustling, uncaring colonial port city. Their hunger was a direct consequence of the exploitative colonial system, yet their attempts to alleviate that hunger were met with the full, often brutal force of imperial law. The penalties, as we've begun to understand, were severe, designed to protect property and uphold a rigid social hierarchy. But before the punishment could be meted out, the food thief first had to be caught. And the colonial authorities, along with private landowners and masters, had their own array of methods, some formal, some terrifyingly informal for detection and apprehension. The ever-watchful, often malevolent overseer's eye was a constant presence. A mainstream historical fact is that on the vast plantations and haciendas that form the agricultural backbone of colonial South America, overseers, known as capataces in Spanish territories or feitores in Brazil, played an absolutely crucial and often notoriously brutal role in enforcing labor discipline and very significantly preventing the theft of crops, livestock, and provisions by the enslaved or coerced workforce. These overseers were the frontline enforcers of the master's will and the protectors of his property. Their job description, if it had been formally written down, probably would have read something like, required one stern individual of unwavering loyalty to the esteemed landowner. Must possess an eagle eye for detecting unauthorized sugarcane chewing, an uncanny sixth sense for locating suspiciously plump chickens in slave quarters, and the ability to inspire profound terror and unquestioning obedience through a combination of loud yelling creative threats and the judicious frequent application of a very large, very sturdy whip. An appreciation for early mornings and a complete lack of basic human empathy considered a definite plus. Imagine yourself Egeria as an enslaved worker on a sprawling sugar plantation in Pernambuco, or perhaps a coerced indigenous laborer on a Peruvian hacienda. The overseer is a constant menacing shadow. He patrols the fields on horseback, his gaze sweeping for any sign of shirking any hint of insubordination, any suspicious bulge under a tunic that might conceal a stolen ear of maize or a few illicitly gathered sweet potatoes. He monitors the granaries, the storerooms, the livestock pens with unblinking vigilance. He might conduct sudden unannounced searches of slave quarters, tearing apart meager belongings in search of hoarded or stolen food. His power is often absolute, his methods frequently savage. Being caught by an overseer in the act of taking food often meant immediate brutal punishment on the spot. A savage flogging, confinement in stocks with no food or water, or other forms of summary justice, long before any formal legal proceedings might even be considered. Larger estates, or those holding particularly valuable commodities like silver from the mines or processed sugar from the mills, would often employ armed guards or maintain small private militias. These men would patrol the boundaries, guard the storehouses, and respond with force to any organized attempts at theft or raiding by, say, communities of runaway slaves, quilombos or palenques, or bands of outlaws. In the colonial towns and cities, a more formal, if often woefully inadequate and corrupt system of policing might exist. In later colonial periods, figures like the Serenos Night Watchman patrolled urban streets, theoretically maintaining order and deterring crime, including theft from marketplaces, shops, and wealthy residences. But their effectiveness, particularly in the sprawling, impoverished barrios where many food thefts driven by desperation occurred, was likely quite limited. Wealthy merchants and homeowners would rely more on their own private guards, sturdy doors, and barred windows. The effectiveness and actual pervasiveness of formally constituted policing structures in colonial South America, particularly in rural areas or on the vast, often remote agricultural estates, versus the much more common reliance on informal community surveillance among property owners at least, and the direct, often brutal, private punitive power wielded by individual masters, overseers, and landowners in detecting and apprehending suspected food thieves is a complex issue. With evidence suggesting a highly variable patchwork system of enforcement that depended heavily on local conditions, the specific nature of the alleged theft, and the social status of both the accuser and the accused. Beyond these more direct methods of surveillance, the very structure of colonial society, with its deep social divisions, its atmosphere of fear, and its encouragement of denunciation, played a significant role in catching food thieves. In a tense, hierarchical society where rewards might be offered for information, or where currying favor with a powerful master or official could bring benefits, informers were common. An enslaved person, perhaps under duress, or hoping for slightly better treatment, might betray a fellow slave who had stolen food. Neighbors in a crowded urban slum, driven by their own hunger or by petty disputes, might denounce someone they suspected of pilfering from the local market. A disgruntled servant might report a theft from their master's pantry. The colonial authorities often actively encouraged such denunciations as a means of social control. If you were feeling particularly mischievous or held a grudge in colonial South America, Algeria, and you wanted to cause some serious trouble for your neighbor, you didn't just anonymously report them for having an untidy front yard or playing their lute too loudly after hours. Oh no. You might discreetly whisper to the local magistrate or the parish priest, "Psst, Your Excellency Don Diego. I happen to observe young Pedro, son of the notoriously shiftless turnip farmer, looking with what I can only describe as excessive and a suspiciously joyful longing at your prize-winning, almost divinely plump mango tree just yesterday. Just saying, that valuable piece of civic-minded information is surely worth at least one slightly less bruised, perhaps slightly smaller mango from my own table, wouldn't you agree?" A quirky or fringe tidbit, though a rather grim one, is that enslaved people with their profound desperation and their intimate knowledge of the workings of a plantation or household often developed incredibly ingenious methods for pilfering and concealing small amounts of food. They might hide grains or beans in their elaborately braided hair, carry water or even stolen rum or molasses in carefully hollowed-out gourds or sections of bamboo that appeared to be simple walking sticks, or even in extreme cases swallow small, valuable items like spices or coffee beans to be retrieved later. The discovery of such ingenious methods by infuriated overseers would of course only lead to even more invasive, humiliating, and brutal searches and punishments. The act of being caught, Algeria, would be a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. Imagine the overseer's booming shout, the sudden grab of rough hands, the certainty of the pain to follow. Getting caught with a single illicitly acquired potato in colonial South America wasn't a simple "oops, my sincere apologies, won't happen again" kind of social blunder. It was much more like finding yourself the unwilling star in your own very short, very unhappy and intensely personal action movie, where the whip-wielding overseer is the undisputed and entirely unsympathetic villain. The humble potato is the tragically unobtainable MacGuffin, and the grand dramatic finale almost invariably involves a lot of very loud yelling, a significant amount of physical discomfort for you, and a distinct, disappointing lack of a heroic stunt double available for the flogging scene. And of course, the pervasive prejudice and stereotypes we discussed earlier meant that individuals from marginalized groups, enslaved Africans, indigenous peoples, the mixed-race poor, were already under a cloud of suspicion. They were often the first to be accused, even with the flimsiest of evidence, simply because colonial society expected them to be thieves, to be untrustworthy, to be inherently prone to criminality. The overseer's eye, and indeed the eye of colonial justice itself, was often heavily filtered by these ingrained biases, making escape from accusation once made incredibly difficult for those at the bottom of the social ladder. The net of colonial surveillance, both formal and informal, was cast wide, and its mesh was particularly fine when it came to guarding the precious food resources that underpinned the entire imperial enterprise. The overseer's eye, Algeria, or perhaps the denunciation of a fearful neighbor or a hopeful informer, has done its work. You, in your imagined persona as a desperate inhabitant of colonial South America, have been apprehended in the act of or accused of stealing food. That precious life-sustaining commodity that for so many was so tragically out of reach. The immediate, often brutal, on-the-spot justice of a plantation master or an enraged shopkeeper might already have been administered. But what if your case, for whatever reason, proceeds to a more formal, or at least semi-formal level of colonial adjudication? What did a courtroom look like, and what semblance of justice, if any, could a person accused of pilfering a loaf of bread or a few ears of maize actually expect in this rigidly hierarchical and often unforgiving world? Prepare yourself, Algeria, for a legal process that for the vast majority of those accused of food theft, particularly if they were enslaved indigenous or from the impoverished European or mixed-race underclass, was often swift, summary, and heavily weighted against them. A mainstream historical fact is that judicial proceedings for common crimes, like food theft in colonial South America, especially when the accused were from these marginalized groups, frequently lacked what we would consider basic due process. Formal legal protections, access to any kind of effective defense or representation, and the impartial weighing of evidence were often minimal or entirely absent, with judgments delivered quickly and punishments enacted with alarming speed, all reflecting the ingrained power dynamics and deep social hierarchies of the colonial system. a fair trial for food theft in colonial South America if you happen to be, say, an escaped enslaved person caught with a suspiciously plump and clearly not self-acquired chicken. That judicial process usually involved the plantation owner acting as the primary accuser. The sole witness for the prosecution, the presiding judge, the foreman of the jury, which consisted mainly of his own equally outraged eyebrows, and often the chief enthusiastic administrator of the subsequent corrective and highly educational flogging. Very efficient, very comprehensively one-sided. The courtroom itself could be a highly variable setting. For enslaved individuals on a vast Brazilian sugar ingeno, or a Peruvian silver hacienda, the highest judicial authority they might ever face was their own master, or his appointed overseer or estate administrator. Justice in these cases would be dispensed in the master's house in the plantation office, or even directly in the fields or slave quarters. A summary judgment often based on little more than the overseer's accusation, followed by immediate, brutal corporal punishment. There would be no appeal. No defense attorney. Your court-appointed lawyer in such a scenario would most likely be the slightly confused-looking goat, tied up outside the overseer's hut, who seems about as keenly interested in the finer points of your legal defense as he is in advanced metallurgical principles or existential philosophy. In colonial towns and cities, minor cases of food theft might be brought before a local magistrate such as an alcalde ordinario, a municipal magistrate in Spanish towns, or a juiz ordinario, his Portuguese equivalent, or perhaps dealt with by the cabildo, the town council in Spanish territories, or the Câmara Municipal in Brazil. These proceedings would have a slightly more formal veneer. There might be a designated courthouse or administrative building, a robed magistrate, a clerk taking perhaps rather selective notes. But even here, for petty offenses committed by individuals of low social standing, the process was often summary. The accused would be brought in, the accusation read, perhaps a witness or two would speak usually for the prosecution, and the magistrate would deliver his judgment often within a matter of hours, if not minutes. The degree to which colonial judicial officials in South America genuinely attempted to apply the often complex and theoretically quite protective aspects of Iberian metropolitan law, like certain provisions within the Leyes de Indias or the Ordenações Filipinas, in relatively minor cases involving marginalized individuals accused of everyday crimes like food theft, versus routinely prioritizing the swift maintenance of public order and the unambiguous protection of elite property interests through quick, exemplary, and often quite harsh punishment, is a critical area of ongoing historical research and debate, scrutinizing the gap between legal theory and lived reality in the colonial world. What about evidence? In a society without forensic science, evidence in food theft cases often relied heavily on eyewitness testimony, which could be biased, mistaken, or even malicious, or the accused of being caught in possession of the stolen goods. Confessions were highly valued, but these could sometimes be extracted under duress, through intimidation, or even through the application of torture. Although formal judicial torture was usually reserved for more serious crimes, or during the investigation of major conspiracies, rather than for a simple case of a stolen loaf of bread. However, an informal persuasion by an overseer or a local constable to elicit a confession was probably not uncommon. The very social status and race of the accused often functioned as a de facto presumption of guilt. An enslaved African and indigenous person, often not fluent in Spanish or Portuguese and unfamiliar with European legal procedures, or a known vagrant or beggar, would face an uphill battle to prove their innocence against the word of a European colonist or property owner. Their own testimony, if allowed at all, might carry little weight, only very rarely for cases of exceptionally large-scale food theft, or if the theft involved violence escalating it to robbery robo, or if it was considered a particularly egregious offense against the church or high-ranking state officials, might the case make its way to the higher royal courts, the audiencias, in the Spanish colonies. These were more formal affairs with trained lawyers and more elaborate procedures. But even here, access to true justice for the poor and marginalized was severely limited by lack of resources, social prejudice, and the immense power wielded by the colonial elite. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in some very remote frontier areas or within certain indigenous communities that retained a degree of autonomy, or even sometimes among enslaved populations on isolated plantations, justice for minor offenses like food theft might occasionally be handled entirely outside the formal colonial legal structures. This could involve appealing to a respected local priest for mediation, or resorting to traditional indigenous forms of dispute resolution, or even in some unverified and possibly rather fanciful accounts, forms of local divination or community consensus to determine guilt and impose a suitable if unofficial sanction. These would be shadows of justice operating in the margins of imperial law. The outcome of most food theft cases that did come before a colonial authority was depressingly often a swift conviction followed by immediate sentencing. The range of peculiar penalties from public humiliation to brutal floggings and beyond was designed not just to punish the individual, but to send a clear and terrifying message to anyone else whose empty belly might be tempting them towards a forbidden bite. The colonial courtroom for a food thief was rarely a place of nuanced deliberation. It was more often the antechamber to punishment, a stage for the reassertion of colonial power and the sanctity of property over the desperate pleas of hunger. Imagine the scene. The evidence before this esteemed colonial court is quite clear. Your Excellency, this unfortunate peasant was discovered with not one, not two, but 3 illicitly acquired and suspiciously plump potatoes. 3. This is not mere hunger. Your Excellency, this is clearly the work of a hardened criminal mastermind with a dangerous starch-based and potentially society-destabilizing potato hoarding agenda. We demand the full and preferably quite unpleasantly peculiar wrath of the law. The very concept of proportionality in sentencing ageria was often, let's just say, remarkably flexible and usually not in the defendant's favor. The swift, often summary justice of the colonial courtroom, or perhaps more accurately, the magistrate's stuffy office or the plantation owner's veranda, has run its course ageria. You in your imagined persona as a desperate soul driven by hunger to steal a meager portion of food, that single cassava root, those few ears of maize, that slightly bruised but still edible mango, have been apprehended, accused, and with little ceremony or opportunity for a robust defense found guilty. The pronouncements of Iberian law filtered through the lens of colonial power and social hierarchy have deemed your actions a transgression against property and order. Now, what peculiar penalties await you not for grand larceny or violent robbery, but for this simple, desperate act of pilfering sustenance? One of the most common, most visible, and most psychologically potent forms of punishment for such minor offenses was public humiliation, a carefully orchestrated shames display designed to make an example of you and to etch the consequences of disobedience into the collective memory of the community. A mainstream historical fact is that public humiliation was a widely employed form of punishment in colonial South America, as it was throughout much of early modern Europe, from which these colonial powers derived their legal and social customs. For a society deeply concerned with honor, reputation, and the maintenance of a rigid social order, shame could be a powerful tool of control, often considered as effective, if not more so in some cases than mere physical pain in deterring certain types of behavior. Devices like the pillory picota in Spanish pelourinho in Portuguese and the stocks, cepo, were common fixtures in the central plazas or marketplaces of colonial towns and cities, serving as public stages for the enactment of this shaming justice. So imagine yourself a Jeria, having been convicted of, say, unlawfully communing with a neighbor's prize-winning pumpkin with intent to consume. Your sentence not necessarily a lengthy prison term. Jails were often squalid, holding places rather than centers for long-term incarceration for petty offenders, or a ruinous fine which you, as a likely impoverished individual, couldn't pay anyway. No, your penalty is to be placed in the pillory. This wooden structure, often raised on a small platform for maximum visibility, has holes for your head and hands, forcing you into an uncomfortable, fixed, and utterly exposed posture. You are locked in, unable to move freely, unable to shield yourself from the elements or the reactions of the crowd. The view is decidedly limited. The comfort level is roughly equivalent to attempting to take a long involuntary nap on a bed made entirely of very angry, very pointy porcupines. And the local children, bless their innocent, easily entertained little hearts, are probably using you for enthusiastic, if somewhat inaccurate target practice with a delightful selection of overripe tomatoes, miscellaneous vegetable peelings, and perhaps even a few well-aimed clods of mud. It's a truly full-sensory, deeply immersive experience in the practical application of colonial justice. You would be left there for hours, perhaps even a full day or more, depending on the severity of your minor crime and the particular zeal of the local magistrate. You are exposed to the scorching sun of a tropical afternoon, or the chilling damp of a highland evening, or perhaps a sudden drenching downpour. But the physical discomfort, while considerable, is often secondary to the intense psychological torment of public shame. Everyone in the town, your neighbors, acquaintances, local officials, visiting merchants, even strangers, can see you in your disgrace. They might mock you, jeer at you, hurl insults along with their refuse. Your crime, however small and driven by whatever desperation, is now a public spectacle, your humiliation a lesson for all to see. The effectiveness of these highly public shaming rituals like the pillory and stocks as genuine long-term deterrents to crime in colonial South America versus their perhaps more significant role in simply reinforcing existing social hierarchies, providing a form of often cruel public spectacle and entertainment, and asserting the power of the colonial state to degrade and control its subjects, is a complex and often sobering question actively analyzed by social historians of crime. Punishment and colonial power dynamics. Another common method of public humiliation was to be paraded through the streets of the town. You might be forced to wear the stolen item, that wilted cabbage, those few potatoes, that single scrawny chicken, hung around your neck like a degrading necklace of your transgression. Sometimes a sign crudely lettered with your offense would be placed upon you, as you are marched through the dusty or muddy thoroughfares, perhaps barefoot. And in ragged clothing, a town crier, a pregonero, might walk ahead of you, his voice booming out your name and your crime for all to hear his pronouncements, often laced with derisive commentary. Oyes, oyes, oyes. He might bellow, thoroughly enjoying his moment of civic importance. Behold, good citizens of Cartagena or Lima or Bahia, as the case may be, gaze upon the villainous cabbage bandit of our fair city, caught red-handed in the act of purloining 3 perfectly good, if slightly undersized heads of said vegetable from the esteemed garden of Doña Isabella. Let their leafy shame be a warning to you all. You meanwhile, Egeria, probably just want the earth to open up and swallow you whole, or perhaps for a sudden, very localized, cabbage-specific earthquake to create a suitable diversion. You briefly consider a dramatic career change to hermit living in a very remote, entirely cabbage-free cave, where public declarations of minor vegetable-related infractions are simply not a thing. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that sometimes the shaming rituals could be even more specific and theatrically tailored to the crime or the individual. If you stole a pig, for instance, you might in some locales be forced to wear a pair of crudely fashioned pig ears or a pig's snout while confined in the pillory, or even be made to walk on all fours for a time, adding an extra layer of animalistic degradation to your punishment. Local wits and balladeers might even compose impromptu satirical songs or verses mocking your plight and ensuring your infamy lingered long after the physical discomfort had faded. The purpose of all this, beyond simple retribution, was manifold. It was a powerful deterrent, certainly. Witnessing the public degradation of a fellow community member for even a minor theft would make others think twice. It reinforced social norms and the sanctity of property rights, constantly reminding the populace of the boundaries of acceptable behavior. And significantly, it was a tool of social control, a way of keeping marginalized populations in their place, reminding them of their subordinate status and the swift, visible consequences of any challenge, however small, to the established colonial order. The impact on you, the individual subjected to such public humiliation, would be devastating and long-lasting. The physical pain of flogging might heal, but the sting of public shame, the social ostracism, the difficulty of regaining your reputation and finding acceptance within your community could endure for years, if not a lifetime. After a delightful and character-building afternoon spent locked in the town stocks, and Egeria, you're not just suddenly free to go about your business as if nothing happened. Oh no. You're now free to go about your business with the newly acquired and rather difficult to shake social status of that person who got very publicly stuck in the stocks for attempting to illegally appropriate 3 slightly past their prime turnips. It really does wonders for your future dating prospects, your ability to get a good price for your wares at the local market, and your general desire to ever show your face in public again. This emphasis on shame's display on the theatricality of punishment for even petty food theft is a peculiar and telling characteristic of the colonial justice system, revealing a society deeply concerned with appearances, with public order, and with the constant visible reinforcement of its own power. The stocks have creaked open. Igoraya the pillory has released its uncomfortable embrace in the jeers of the colonial town. Square crowd are perhaps beginning to fade into a dull, throbbing ache in your ears and your spirit. You, in your imagined role as a food thief in colonial South America, have endured the peculiar and potent penalty of public humiliation, that theatrical display of shame designed to etch the boundaries of acceptable behavior onto the collective consciousness. But what if the magistrate, the plantation overseer, or the aggrieved landowner deemed that mere social degradation was insufficient for your crime of acquiring a forbidden feast, however meager? What if they decided that your transgression, your desperate reach for sustenance, required a more direct, more visceral, more painfully persuasive form of correction? Then, Egeria, you would likely face the brutal reality of corporal punishment, and specifically the sharp, stinging bite of the lash. A mainstream historical fact, and a grim one at that, is that flogging or whipping azotes in Spanish açoites and Portuguese was an incredibly ubiquitous and brutally routine form of corporal punishment throughout colonial South America, as indeed it was across much of early modern Europe and its global empires. It was the colonial authorities' go-to multi-purpose disciplinary tool applied with depressing frequency for a vast spectrum of offenses, from minor acts of disobedience and petty theft very much, including food theft, to more serious crimes, and with particular systemic savagery as a primary instrument for controlling and terrorizing enslaved African populations and subjugated indigenous laborers. In colonial South America, it often seemed like the official response to almost any perceived minor infraction, from looking at an overseer the wrong way to accidentally dropping a valuable clay pot, or perhaps even just humming a slightly too cheerful and therefore suspiciously unsubservient tune while mending fishing nets, was invariably, this situation clearly calls for, yes, you guessed it, significantly more flogging. Imagine yourself, Egeria, having been caught with that illicitly acquired handful of maize or that liberated piece of cassava. If public shaming in the stocks wasn't deemed sufficient, or if you were an enslaved person for whom such leniency was rarely considered your next stop, might well be the whipping post. This could be a sturdy wooden post erected in the public plaza, the courtyard of a government building, or on a plantation or hacienda, a designated tree or structure within the estate, often chosen for its visibility. The ritual of flogging was frequently, though, not always a public spectacle designed like the pillory to maximize its deterrent effect on any onlookers. The process itself was one of calculated degradation and intense physical pain. You would likely be stripped at least to the waist, exposing your back to the lash. Your hands might be tied to the post above your head, or you might be forced to bend over a whipping block or barrel, rendering you immobile and vulnerable. Then the instrument of punishment would be brought forth. This could vary. Sometimes it was a heavy leather whip, the kind that could raise welts with a single stroke. Other times it might be a cat-o'-nine-tails with multiple knotted cords designed to inflict maximum pain and laceration. Or it could be simpler, but no less brutal implements like sturdy rods, canes, or even lengths of tough, dried vine. The person administering the punishment, perhaps an official executioner or verdugo in larger town, a plantation overseer or fighter on an estate, or even a soldier or town guard, would then lay into your bared back with practiced, often merciless efficiency. The number of lashes was usually prescribed by the sentencing authority, the magistrate, the master, the overseer. For a relatively minor food theft by a free but impoverished person, it might be 10, 20, or perhaps 50 lashes a number, sufficient to cause significant pain, bleeding, and bruising, but not necessarily intended to be fatal. Though infection in the aftermath was always a grave risk in an era before antibiotics. For an enslaved person caught stealing food, however, the number of lashes could be far higher, 100, 200, or even more, often delivered with a ferocity intended not just to punish, but to terrorize, to break the spirit, and to serve as an unforgettable warning to every other enslaved individual who might even contemplate a similar act of defiance. The physical reality of this punishment, Egeria, would have been excruciating. The searing pain of each blow, the tearing of skin, the flow of blood, the subsequent agony of infected wounds, and the permanent scars that would serve as a lifelong reminder of your transgression. Beyond the immediate physical torment, there was the profound psychological trauma, the terror leading up to the flogging, the utter helplessness and degradation during the act itself, and the lingering shame and fear afterwards. So you snuck what the authorities might dramatically term a forbidden feast, of, say, 3 slightly undersized but undeniably stolen potatoes because you hadn't eaten in 2 days. The colonial authorities, in their infinite wisdom and commitment to upholding the sanctity of Don Rodrigo's potato patch, might then graciously offer you a complimentary tasting menu of their finest locally sourced cat o' nine tails, typically served with a generous side order of public humiliation. A large dollop of "don't you ever even think about looking sideways at a potato again." Or next time it's 50 lashes and a forced apprenticeship as a scarecrow. And absolutely no dessert. It was a culinary exchange program you most definitely did not want to sign up for. Historians continue to analyze the grimly dual function of public flogging in the social and legal landscape of colonial South America. Whether its primary stated aim was truly the physical chastisement and correction of the individual offender, with a view to their unlikely moral reform, or if its far greater and more insidious significance lay in its highly theatrical, ritualized performance of absolute state and masterly power. It was designed to systematically intimidate and control the broader subjugated populations of enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples through the calculated and unforgettable application of exemplary physical terror. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in some colonial settings, specific locations became notorious as whipping posts, their very presence a constant silent threat. The public spectacle of flogging could disturbingly draw crowds, becoming a grim form of public entertainment or what was perceived as moral instruction for the masses. Some surviving colonial records or chronicles even occasionally detail the specific types of whips favored by particularly notorious overseers, or even attempt to create informal tariffs or customary scales of lashes for specific minor offenses, a chillingly bureaucratic approach to the administration of brutality. The colonial authorities and the European elite, whose property and power they protected, largely subscribed to the theory that witnessing someone else get vigorously and often bloodily flogged for, say, stealing a single turnip from the master's private vegetable garden would instantly and permanently extinguish any latent desire within you to engage in similar acts of illicit root vegetable acquisition. In reality, while the fear was undoubtedly a powerful deterrent for many, for those pushed to the absolute brink by starvation, it probably just made them significantly more cunning, more desperate, and a lot better at not getting caught the next time they were truly existentially hungry for a turnip. The lash's bite was a brutal, ever-present reality in the world of colonial food thieves. A sharp, stinging reminder of where power truly lay. The sharp sting of the lash, Ageria, and the burning shame of public exposure in the pillory or stocks have now given you a rather visceral understanding of how colonial South American authorities dealt with those caught engaging in petty food pilfering. These were punishments designed to be swift, memorable, and highly visible, a clear warning to anyone else whose stomach might be rumbling with desperate illicit intent. But what if your crime, Ageria, was deemed more serious? What if you were a repeat offender, your name already unpleasantly familiar to the local magistrate? Or what if the food you liberated was not just a handful of cassava roots, but a more substantial quantity of grain? A prized pig, or perhaps even a couple of valuable llamas from a wealthy hacendado's herd? In such cases, the penalties often escalated beyond mere public humiliation or a corrective flogging, entering the grim and often life-altering realms of harsh forced labor or remote desolate banishment. A mainstream historical fact is that in colonial Spanish and Portuguese America, individuals convicted of a wide variety of crimes, certainly including significant or repeated theft of food or other goods, were frequently sentenced to long, arduous terms of forced labor. This wasn't just about punishment, it was also about exploiting a cheap captive workforce for the benefit of the colonial economy and the imperial state. So you've unfortunately graduated from being a minor, opportunistic turnip pilferer to perhaps a slightly more ambitious, semi-professional, unauthorized goat acquisition specialist. Your sentencing options now undergo a rather significant and decidedly unpleasant upgrade. The local magistrate, after a brief, probably rather one-sided trial, might clear his throat, adjust his slightly askew powdered wig, and declare, "For your repeated and flagrant disregard for the sanctity of Don Rodrigo's goat population, the court sentences you to Option A, a delightful, all-expenses-paid multi-year working vacation in the glamorous, world-renowned silver mines of Potosi, featuring absolutely stunning subterranean scenery and complimentary lifelong lung diseases. Or perhaps option B, a deeply fulfilling artisanal craft retreat in a lovely, entirely windowless auberge, where you can joyfully weave coarse woolen textiles for approximately 18 hours a day until your fingers bleed or your spirit completely gives out. Do choose your preferred path to state-sponsored doom, my dear fellow. Or more likely, we'll just choose for you. Condemnation to the mines was for many a virtual death sentence. The silver mines of Potosi in Upper Peru, modern Bolivia, or Zacatecas in Mexico. Though our focus is South America. Potosi is the prime example, and the gold mines of Minas Gerais in Brazil, or parts of New Granada, modern Colombia, were infamous for their horrific working conditions. Imagine yourself Egeria, forced deep into the bowels of the earth, into dark, narrow, dangerously unstable tunnels, often with little to no ventilation. You would be toiling for incredibly long hours, engaged in back-breaking labor, hacking at rock faces with primitive tools, carrying immensely heavy loads of ore up rickety ladders, all in stifling heat or freezing cold, depending on the altitude and depth of the mine. The air would be thick with dust, the constant threat of tunnel collapses or explosions ever present. And then there was the mercury poisoning. In silver mining, mercury was often used in the amalgamation process to extract the precious metal from its ore. The laborers, including many convicted food thieves sentenced to mine work, were exposed to toxic mercury vapors, leading to debilitating illnesses, neurological damage, and a slow, agonizing death. The mortality rates in these colonial mines were appallingly high. The good news, if you could call it that, about being sentenced to the Potosi silver mines for perhaps stealing a few too many sacks of quinoa. To feed your starving village, you probably wouldn't have to worry about food theft ever again. The bad news, you probably wouldn't have to worry about much of anything else for very long either. It was a remarkably effective, if somewhat brutally final solution to the problem of repeat offending. Another common destination for those sentenced to forced labor was the auberge or textile workshop. These were essentially early factories, often operating under prison-like conditions where indigenous laborers, debtors, and convicted criminals, including food thieves, were forced to spin thread and weave cloth, usually coarse woolen or cotton textiles, for the colonial market. The hours were incredibly long, the work monotonous and physically demanding. The overseers often brutal, and the pay, if any, non-existent or barely enough to cover a meager food ration. You might be locked into the auberge for years, your life reduced to the endless, mind-numbing rhythm of the loom or the spinning wheel. The extent to which this entire system of penal forced labor in colonial South America was primarily intended as a straightforward judicial mechanism for punishing crime and, perhaps in some optimistic colonial theories, reforming offenders through hard work versus being in harsh reality, a thinly veiled and ruthlessly efficient, economically driven institution for coercing a cheap, expendable, and easily controlled workforce for the most dangerous, undesirable, and yet highly profitable colonial enterprises like precious metal mining or mass textile production is a critical and often deeply disturbing area of ongoing study for historians of labor law and the brutal economics of colonialism. Beyond forced labor in mines or workshops, exile or banishment, destero was another severe penalty that could be imposed particularly for individuals deemed troublesome repeat offenders or those whose food theft was seen as part of a larger pattern of social disorder. You might be sentenced to be transported to a remote, inhospitable frontier presidio, a fortified military outpost on the edge of explored territory, to a desolate penal island, or simply banished from your home region and forced to wander as an outcast. Congratulations, my dear Egeria, the colonial magistrate might declare with a flourish of his quill, for your persistent and unrepentant enthusiasm regarding your neighbor's prize-winning and now sadly depleted manioc patch. The court has decided to grant you a unique opportunity for personal growth and geographical exploration. You are hereby banished for a period of no less than 10 years to the delightful mosquito-infested and entirely uncharted swamp, located approximately 300 miles up that rather crocodile-rich river on the very edge of nowhere useful. Don't forget to write. Though one must admit regular mail service to your new picturesque and almost certainly entirely uninhabited address is understandably a bit spotty these days. Such banishment was not just a physical removal, it was a form of social death, cutting you off from your family, your community, your ancestral lands, and any familiar means of support, often with dire consequences for survival. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some sentences of forced labor in mines or presidios or terms of exile were sometimes for incredibly specific, almost bizarrely precise long terms like 10 years and 1 day or 7 years, 3 months, and 2 weeks. The 1 day or the extra few weeks might have had some obscure legal or symbolic significance in Iberian law. Or perhaps it was just a bureaucratic flourish away for the colonial judicial system to emphasize the absolute precision and inexorable nature of its sentences, even when condemning someone to a fate that was often in effect a slow execution. The decision to impose these harsher penalties, the years of crushing labor in a Potosi mine, the soul-destroying confinement of an Oberoi, the desolate isolation of exile, would typically come from higher colonial courts like the Audiencias, or from powerful regional governors for crimes deemed too serious for just a local flogging. And for the food thief whose desperation led them to repeatedly offend or to steal something of significant value, this escalation of punishment was an ever-present, terrifying possibility. A stark reminder that in colonial South America, the protection of property, especially that which fueled the imperial economy, often took a brutal and unforgiving precedence over the most basic human need for sustenance. The grim realities of colonial justice in South America have unfolded before your sleepy eyes, Egeria. You've seen how the sting of the lash, the shame of the pillory, and the soul-crushing despair of forced labor in mines or remote exile were the common currency of punishment for those who dared to steal food in this world of stark inequalities. These were penalties designed to inflict pain, to humiliate, and to serve as terrifying deterrents. But was there a point at which the desperate act of taking sustenance, of trying to fill an empty belly, could cross a line into an offense so grave that it demanded the ultimate penalty? Could stealing food in certain extreme circumstances actually lead to a sentence of death? Sadly, Egeria, in the often brutal calculus of colonial law and order, the answer was indeed sometimes yes. This was when your death for dinner wasn't just a metaphorical turn of phrase, but a potential literal outcome. A mainstream historical fact is that while capital punishment was not typically the standard sentence for simple, petty food theft by a first-time offender, especially if that offender was a poor colonist rather than an enslaved person or a rebellious indigenous individual, it could indeed be applied for food-related crimes under specific and usually quite serious, aggravating circumstances. The colonial legal systems inherited from Spain and Portugal certainly had no compunction about employing the death penalty for a wide range of offenses deemed to threaten property authority or the established social and religious order. When might stealing food escalate to a capital crime? Firstly, as we touched upon when discussing plantation raids, if the theft was large-scale organized and involved violence or armed resistance, it would almost certainly be treated as a capital offense. Those communities of runaway slaves and their quilombos or palenques or disaffected indigenous groups who launched raids on haciendas, not just for food, but also for weapons, tools, or to liberate others, were seen by the colonial authorities as engaging in open rebellion and warfare, not mere thievery. If caught, their leaders and many participants could expect little mercy. Their actions directly challenged the economic foundations of the colony and the institution of slavery or forced labor, and the response was designed to be utterly crushing. So you started your hypothetical criminal career by borrowing a single slightly bruised turnip from the edge of a field. Then, perhaps emboldened by initial success or just increasing desperation, you accidentally acquired an entire sack of very appealing potatoes. Now, in a fit of misguided ambition, you've liberated the entire viceroy's prize-winning herd of llamas for a rather large, unsanctioned village barbecue. Your criminal career, my friend, is escalating with alarming rapidity, and so too, you can be quite sure, are the potential penalties. At this point, you're probably hoping your defense involves a really good lawyer, or perhaps just a very, very fast getaway chariot. Secondly, if the act of stealing food was accompanied by violence against a person, for example, if a food thief, when confronted, injured or killed an overseer, a landowner, or even a common citizen, then the crime would escalate from simple theft, hurto, to robbery with violence, robocon violencia, which was almost invariably a capital offense. The law made a clear distinction between stealthy pilfering and aggressive, violent appropriation. Thirdly, as we explored when considering the theft of sacred sustenance, particularly egregious acts of sacrilege involving the church's property or consecrated items could, in extreme cases, especially if combined with perceived heresy or a defiant challenge to church authority potentially lead to a capital sentence. While burning at the stake was more typically reserved for unrepentant heretics or those convicted of witchcraft by the Inquisition, severe sacrilege blurred these lines, and the Church often demanded the harshest possible punishments from the secular authorities for offenses against its sanctity. The colonial authorities, eager to maintain their alliance with the powerful Church, would usually oblige, fourthly stealing directly from the crown or from very high-ranking officials. For instance, raiding royal storehouses or pilfering significant provisions intended for the military or the viceroy's personal household could be interpreted as a form of treason or lèse-majesté, an offense against the sovereign power, again potentially carrying the death penalty. And fifthly, there was the issue of reincidencia, or repeat offending. Even if an individual's initial food thefts were minor and resulted in lesser punishments like flogging or public humiliation, a persistent pattern of thievery, a refusal to be corrected by these initial penalties, could lead a magistrate to deem the offender incorrigible, a hardened criminal a permanent threat to public order and private property. In such cases, the penalties would escalate with each conviction, and eventually even for what might individually seem like relatively minor acts of food theft, a long-suffering or simply exasperated colonial judge might decide that only the ultimate penalty would suffice to rid the community of this persistent nuisance. Your case of, say, unauthorized pineapple appropriation on a grand and alarmingly repetitive scale has now gone all the way up to the Royal Audiencia. They are taking your persistent passion for other people's tropical fruit very, very seriously indeed. The learned judges, after much periwigged deliberation and consultation of voluminous legal tomes, are probably debating whether your egregious crimes against pineapple-based property rights merit simple hanging, or perhaps something a little more creatively peculiar and publicly memorable involving, say, a very large, very disappointed parrot and a public lecture on the virtues of respecting pineapple ownership. The precise frequency with which the death penalty was actually carried out in colonial South America for crimes that were primarily or solely food theft as opposed to food theft that was intrinsically combined with more serious charges like armed violence, organized rebellion, or major acts of sacrilege, and how this grim statistic might have varied across different colonial regions, specific time periods, and according to the crucial social and racial status of the accused, is exceptionally difficult to quantify accurately from the surviving judicial records, as these records are often incomplete, sometimes euphemistic, and require careful context-specific historical analysis to disentangle the multiple charges or unstated societal factors that might have led to a capital sentence. The methods of execution employed in colonial South America were generally those common in contemporary Europe. Hanging was a frequent method for common criminals. The garrote, an iron collar tightened by a screw to cause strangulation, was widely used in Spanish colonies. Beheading was usually reserved for nobles convicted of capital crimes in Europe, but might have been used for particularly high-profile rebel leaders in the colonies to make a brutal statement. And, as mentioned, burning at the stake was the terrifying penalty for extreme heresy, though its application directly for just food theft would be exceptionally rare if it happened at all, unless the act was framed as part of a much larger diabolical plot against God and state. A truly grim and quirky, if one can use that word, in such a context tidbit is that sometimes the method of execution for a particularly notorious food raider, a leader of a slave revolt who had organized raids for provisions, or a defiant indigenous chieftain, was deliberately chosen by the colonial authorities to be especially gruesome or symbolically degrading. Furthermore, after the execution, the bodies of such individuals were sometimes dismembered, and their heads or limbs displayed publicly on pikes in prominent locations. A horrific visceral warning designed to terrorize the population and extinguish any embers of resistance. We will, of course, Egeria, keep these images very vague and ungraphic in our sleepy contemplation, focusing on the intent of such displays rather than their visceral reality. The judicial process for capital crimes would typically involve the higher colonial courts, the audiencias, rather than just local magistrates. Death sentences often required confirmation from the highest colonial authority, the viceroy or governor-general, though this review was not always a guarantee of clemency, especially if the crime was seen as threatening the stability or economic interests of the colony. The tragic irony, Egeria, of a person being condemned to death for stealing food, the very substance necessary to sustain life, highlights with chilling clarity the extreme value placed on property order and authority by the colonial regime, often far above the value of individual human life, especially if that life belonged to someone from the lower echelons of their rigidly stratified society. The colonial authorities, one suspects, firmly believed that the most effective way to ensure no one ever again even contemplated the unauthorized acquisition of, say, the local bishop's prize-winning, divinely blessed honeycakes was to make an incredibly public, undeniably final, and terrifyingly, don't even think about looking at the crumbs kind of example of the last unfortunate soul who did. Effective perhaps in its brutality, if a rather extreme and deeply tragic solution for what was often just a simple case of a desperate craving for dessert, or more likely a desperate craving to just stay alive. The grim prospect of death itself. Jeria for the act of stealing food in colonial South America now hangs heavy in the air of our sleepy historical contemplation. We have journeyed through a landscape of stark inequalities where overflowing pantries stood in stark contrast to gnawing hunger, and where the law in its imperial majesty often valued property far above the desperate needs of the human body. From public shaming in the stocks and the brutal bite of the lash to the slow death of forced labor in mines and the desolate emptiness of exile, the penalties for food thieves were designed to be severe to deter and to uphold a rigid colonial order. And for those deemed to have crossed the ultimate line, through large-scale raiding violence, sacrilege, or sheer incorrigible persistence, even the act of taking sustenance could, in this unforgiving world, become a capital crime. The specific, peculiar penalties we have explored, from the theatricality of public humiliation to the grim calculations of penal labor, all speak of a society grappling with fundamental issues of control resources and the very definition of justice. As these somber images begin to fade, as the sounds of the colonial courtroom and the cries of the punished recede into the quiet of your own approaching rest, may you carry with you a gentle understanding of the harsh realities faced by so many in those distant, often difficult times. And may your own dreams be filled with abundance, with fairness, and with the peaceful assurance of a world where no one ever has to risk death for a simple dinner. The grim and often terrifyingly public theater of colonial punishment has now played out before your mind's eye, Ageria. You've seen how the theft of food in colonial South America, an act often born of the most profound human desperation, could lead to shaming in the pillory. The brutal bite of the last years of crushing forced labor in mines or obrages. The desolate loneliness of exile, or even in the most extreme circumstances, the finality of capital punishment. The laws of imperial Spain and Portugal and the colonial authorities who enforced them viewed food theft primarily as a crime against sacred property rights, a challenge to the established social order, and an affront to their authority. But what of those on the other side of this equation? How did the perpetrators themselves, the enslaved Africans, the subjugated indigenous peoples, the impoverished colonists, view their own actions? Did they see themselves merely as common criminals, deserving of such harsh retribution? Or did they perhaps operate under a different kind of law? A more ancient and primal understanding, the unwritten, unyielding Hunger's Law, which whispered that the need to survive, to feed oneself and one's family, might sometimes justify a forbidden bite. It's crucial to remember, Ageria, that for many of those accused of food theft, their actions were not driven by greed or malicious intent, but by the most fundamental human instinct, the will to live. When you are facing starvation, when your children are crying from empty bellies, the abstract legal concept of private property, especially the hoarded abundance of a wealthy landowner or a distant colonial master, can begin to seem very remote, very unjust, and perhaps even entirely irrelevant. The immediate, gnawing reality of hunger often knows no man-made law. The colonial food thief's primary defense, had they been given a fair chance to articulate it in a court that truly listened, probably wouldn't have involved citing obscure paragraphs from the Siete Partidas or the Ordenações Filipinas. It would have been much simpler, much more direct, and with a certain undeniable, if legally inadmissible, logic. Your Excellency, my esteemed and clearly very well-fed colonial magistrate, my choices, as I perceive them, were as follows. Option A. Diligently continue to steal this rather plump and unattended chicken from Don Fernando's coop, thereby providing a momentary life-sustaining protein infusion for my starving family. Or option B, resolutely decide to become an involuntary and likely quite brief participant in a rather depressing scientific experiment concerning just how long a human being can realistically survive on a diet composed primarily of dust bunnies, righteous indignation, and the occasional unconfirmed rumor of a nearby turnip. I chose the chicken, Your Excellency. It seemed on balance significantly more nutritious and frankly rather less existentially bleak. A mainstream historical fact is that acts of food theft by enslaved individuals and subjugated indigenous populations in colonial South America were often interpreted by these groups themselves not merely as simple criminal acts against a distant legal code, but as necessary and sometimes even morally justifiable means of survival. They were often, in a very real sense, forms of everyday resistance against deeply oppressive and exploitative systems that systematically denied them adequate sustenance and basic human dignity. Consider the perspective of an enslaved African toiling on a Brazilian sugar plantation. Their labor produced immense wealth for their master and for the Portuguese crown, yet they themselves were often provided with rations barely sufficient to keep them alive and working. When an enslaved person stole extra food from the plantation stores, a bit more manioc flour, some beans, perhaps a piece of fruit from the master's orchard, or even a chicken from his coop, was this truly theft in their eyes? Or was it a desperate attempt to supplement a starvation diet, a way to reclaim a tiny fraction of the immense value their own unrewarded labor had created? For many, it was undoubtedly the latter, a small but significant act of defiance, a refusal to passively accept their dehumanizing conditions. Similarly, for indigenous peoples who had seen their ancestral lands confiscated, their traditional farming and hunting grounds turned into colonial haciendas or mining concessions, and their communities forced into systems of tribute and coerced labor, taking food from these now private colonial estates might have felt less like theft and more like a desperate attempt to access resources that were by ancient right and tradition theirs. The extent to which these acts of food theft by various subaltern groups in colonial South America represented conscious, politically motivated acts of organized resistance aimed at actively undermining the colonial system, versus being primarily pragmatic individual or small group survival strategies, born out of immediate, overwhelming desperation, is a nuanced and important question that social historians continue to explore, often by analyzing patterns of theft. The specific targets chosen, any available, though exceedingly rare, direct testimonies or inferred motivations from the accused, and the ways in which colonial authorities themselves perceived and responded to these different forms of appropriation. Even among the poorer European colonists or marginalized mestizo populations, a sense of injustice could fuel food theft. If the colonial system, with its vast inequalities and its concentration of wealth and land in the hands of a small elite, failed to provide even basic subsistence for all its members, then some might feel morally justified in taking what they needed to survive, especially if they saw the conspicuous consumption and hoarded abundance of the rich. The old proverb, "Hunger is a bad counselor," certainly holds true, but perhaps an even older unwritten law whispers that the earth's bounty is meant for all, and that to allow some to starve while others feast is the greater transgression. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that, in some regions of colonial South America, and certainly in later periods, folktales, ballads, and popular legends sometimes arose that romanticized or sympathized with clever outlaws or social bandits. These figures often defied colonial authorities, flouted oppressive laws, and sometimes, at least in the stories, stole from the rich to give to the poor, or at least stole from the powerful to ensure their own survival and that of their community. While these are often later, more romanticized constructions, they can hint at a popular counter-narrative, a lingering folk memory that didn't always align with the official legal condemnation of all forms of theft. It's also plausible that within certain close-knit, marginalized communities, there might have been a degree of complicity or quiet support for those driven to steal food. Neighbors might turn a blind eye, stolen goods might be discreetly shared, or individuals might offer shelter to someone fleeing an overseer or a magistrate, especially if the victim of the theft was a particularly despised landowner or a corrupt official. If you, Egeria, in your imagined persona as a starving peasant, managed to liberate a few of the notoriously wealthy and famously stingy Don Esteban's prize-winning mangoes, the ones he usually just let rot on the tree rather than share with the less fortunate, the local villagers probably weren't rushing to form a posse and turn you in. They were much more likely to discreetly inquire, "Oh, young Pedro borrowed a few of Don Esteban's famously inaccessible mangoes again, did he? Excellent. Do tell him we hope he shares. Those magnificent mangoes are entirely wasted on that old miser anyway. And besides, his great-grandfather probably stole the land they grow on from our ancestors in the first place." This hunger's law, then this primal justification of taking what is needed to survive, existed in a constant uneasy tension with the formal punitive laws of the colonial state. It rarely found expression in the courtroom where the voice of the accused was often silenced or dismissed, but it undoubtedly lived in the hearts and minds of many who found themselves on the wrong side of those formidable legal codes. A silent, desperate counterpoint to the colonial insistence on the absolute sanctity of property, even when that property was food and the alternative was starvation. The forbidden bite in such circumstances might have felt less like a crime and more like an assertion of the fundamental right to exist. You have now journeyed Ageria through the grim yet revealing landscape of crime and punishment in colonial South America, focusing on that most desperate of acts, the theft of food. You've seen how the grand legal codes of empire defined such deeds, how hunger often provided the grim motivation, and how a terrifying array of peculiar penalties, from public shaming in the stocks and the brutal bite of the lash to the slow death of forced labor in mines and the ultimate finality of execution, were deployed to protect property and uphold a rigid social order. We've also considered hunger's law, that unspoken primal justification that might have echoed in the hearts of those who took a forbidden bite simply to survive. Now, as our sleepy historical exploration draws to its close, we must reflect on the enduring echoes of this colonial past, on how these ancient attitudes towards food power and punishment have left their lasting, often deeply troubling imprint on the societies that emerged in their wake. The formal colonial era in South America, with its Spanish viceroys and Portuguese governors general, eventually came to an end largely in the early 19th century, through a series of bloody and protracted wars of independence. New nations were born filled with ideals of liberty, sovereignty, and at least in theory, a more just social order. Flags were changed, new constitutions were written, and statues of European monarchs were perhaps enthusiastically toppled in town squares, possibly in the very same plazas where food thieves were once pilloried. But did the deeply entrenched structures of inequality, the ingrained attitudes towards property, and the power dynamics surrounding who controlled and who lacked access to basic sustenance simply vanish with the departure of the last colonial administrators? Alice Ageria, historical hangovers can be notoriously long-lasting and stubbornly resistant to purely political cures. The colonial era might have officially ended with a flurry of patriotic declarations and some very impressive newly designed national flags. But those old, deeply ingrained attitudes about who deserved to eat the fancy, imported olives and who was generally expected to make do with, well, perhaps the slightly less appealing leftover olive pits, those unfortunately often demonstrated a remarkable and rather depressing persistence for centuries to come. A mainstream historical fact is that the profoundly entrenched social and economic inequalities that were meticulously established during the long colonial period in South America, particularly those concerning the highly unequal distribution of land ownership and the vastly differential access to essential resources, had a profound and lasting impact on the subsequent development of post-colonial societies. These colonial legacies have contributed significantly to ongoing historical challenges related to endemic poverty, social injustice, political instability, and persistent food insecurity in many regions of the continent, even into our modern era. Consider the vast agricultural estates, those haciendas and fazendas that were the backbone of colonial wealth, often built upon dispossessed indigenous lands and worked by coerced or enslaved labor. While independence might have changed the nationality of the landowners or the precise legal framework governing labor, the fundamental structure of large land holdings, latifundia controlled by a small elite, with a large, often landless rural population struggling for subsistence, persisted in many areas for generations, if not centuries. This in turn meant that access to land to grow one's own food, or access to fairly paid agricultural work that could provide enough to feed a family, remained a critical and often contentious issue. The old colonial crime of trespassing to forage for wild foods or stealing a few crops from the edge of a vast estate simply to avoid starvation might find new expression and new forms of legal or extra-legal repression in the post-colonial landscape. The extent to which post-colonial legal reforms and state-building efforts in the newly independent South American nations genuinely succeeded in dismantling or merely superficially reconfigured the underlying colonial-era power structures that had historically criminalized poverty and systematically limited access to essential resources like food and land for marginalized indigenous Afro-descendant and peasant populations, is a critical and often painful area of ongoing debate and reassessment among historians, sociologists, political scientists, and legal scholars across the continent. The new national laws might have spoken of equality and citizens' rights, but the lived reality for many at the bottom of the social hierarchy often remained one of vulnerability and a desperate struggle for daily bread. The very power dynamics surrounding food, who controls its production, its distribution, its price, and who suffers when it is scarce, continue to be a central theme in the social and political life of many South American nations. Debates over land reform, agricultural policy, access to markets, fair wages for farm workers, the rights of indigenous communities to their ancestral territories, and traditional foodways and the challenges of ensuring national food security in a globalized economy. All these modern concerns carry within them the deep, often unacknowledged echoes of those colonial-era struggles over sustenance and survival. Today, Ageria, we might have sophisticated, globally televised debates about the ethics of food deserts in urban areas, the complexities of sustainable agriculture in the face of climate change, and the moral imperatives of fair trade practices. It's almost as if those ancient colonial-era arguments about whose cassava is it anyway, and by what right do you hoard it while others starve, have simply put on a new set of very serious, very globally conscious, and academically peer-reviewed clothes. But the core fundamental issue of who gets to eat well and why, and what happens to those who don't, is still very much on the global menu. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that even in some remote or indigenous communities in South America, today traditional pre-colonial or syncretic systems of justice, resource management, and communal food sharing might still exist, sometimes quietly alongside and occasionally in direct tension with formal state laws and national economic policies. These enduring local customs can offer fascinating alternative perspectives on concepts like property, theft, or the collective responsibility of a community to ensure the well-being of all its members' perspectives that might stand in stark contrast to the more individualistic, property-focused legal traditions inherited from the colonial period. The peculiar penalties of the colonial era, the public shaming, the brutal floggings, the forced labor, have for the most part been officially abolished by modern legal systems that, at least in theory, adhere to international human rights standards. Yet the underlying societal attitudes that once sanctioned such measures, the tendency to criminalize poverty, to stigmatize the marginalized, to prioritize property over human need, can sometimes cast long, lingering shadows, subtly influencing contemporary law enforcement practices, judicial biases, or public perceptions of those who struggle at the very bottom of the socio-economic ladder. Hopefully, Ageria, by looking back with a clear, if sleepy eye at these often harsh and peculiar colonial responses to the desperate act of food theft, we learn a little something valuable. Mainly, perhaps, that creating a society where people are routinely forced to choose between starving and risking brutal punishment for trying to obtain basic sustenance is generally not a sustainable, just, or particularly enlightened recipe for long-term social harmony or collective well-being. And also, on a slightly less profound but equally important note, that colonial viceroys and powerful hacendados really did not like anyone messing with their prize-winning papayas or their carefully inventoried sacks of export-grade cacao beans. Some historical lessons are writ large in codes of law. Others are whispered in the desperate hunger of a stolen meal. Word count 1397. The great colonial cities of South America. Ageria, with their sun-baked plazas where justice was once so publicly and painfully dispensed, now begin to fade into the soft twilight of our sleepy historical journey. We have walked through their marketplaces, peered into their contrasting pantries of abundance and scarcity, and heard the distant ghostly echoes of chains, lashes, and the cries of those punished for the simple, desperate act of stealing food. We've seen how laws imported from distant Iberian empires were used to protect property, maintain a rigid social order, and often to crush the spirits of those who dared to take a forbidden bite in the face of starvation. The peculiar penalties the public, shaming the brutal forced labor. These were all tools of a colonial system that often valued profit over people and control over compassion. Yet even amidst such harshness, we've also glimpsed the enduring human spirit, the hunger's law, that whispered of survival and resistance in the hearts of the oppressed. As the image of those colonial courtrooms and shadowy mine shafts dissolves, and the specific, often cruel details of those ancient punishments recede, may you be left with a gentle understanding of the profound complexities of the past. The world has changed in countless ways since those colonial days, yet the fundamental human need for sustenance, for dignity, for justice remains. May your own dreams be filled with abundance, with fairness, and with the peaceful assurance of a world striving, however imperfectly, to be more compassionate than the one we have just departed.